Are you guys ready to start?
We have a sign ordinance. Size.
I will go ahead and call to order the Planning Commission meeting for February 19th, 2019. First on our agenda is to adopt our agenda. I had one change I'd like to propose, which we've got a pretty full agenda tonight, and we've got a few public hearings. I'm wondering if we shouldn't front load those, just out of respect for people's time in the audience. So
That's nice.
I'd like to propose that we move the public hearing for the docks and the public hearing for Hawks Point to first and second on our discussion items.
Good.
Absolutely.
Did anybody else have any other adjustments? I move that we approve the agenda as adjusted. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We will proceed accordingly. Next on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from the January 15th, 2019 meeting. Anybody have any adjustments or additions?
I have just one. I was listed as being present. I was not present.
I didn't think so.
Well, we don't want to give you credit
Right.
if it's not due. Anything else? I move that we adopt the minutes as presented with the one adjustment for attendees. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved. So, two discussion items tonight. We'll start with the first item is a public hearing on docks. And for those in the audience who are new with us, I'll just let you know that for public hearings, our goal is to, we'll start with a presentation by staff, followed by a discussion among the Planning Commission members. Then I'll open up the public hearing for discussion. We welcome any comments. We just ask that you step to the podium and state your name and address. And once we've heard from everybody, then we'll make a motion to close the public hearing, round out the discussion among the Planning Commission members, and then recommend an action to move forward. So with that, we'll start with the public hearing for the docks. Paul, you going to walk us through?
Yes, thank you, Chair, Commission. Today, I'd like to go through a proposed change to our zoning ordinance, particularly concerning docks. These changes take place in Chapter 28, Waterways, and Chapter 109 of our City Code. Staff had received several inquiries and requests regarding docks, a few of which have been presented to the Planning Commission and City Council. The City Council directed staff to review dock regulations and to eliminate confusion in the City Code and contradictions in the regulations. Questions about regulation, language, and development history have been key in those discussions. As the code is currently written, there are two key chapters, 28 and 109, that deal with this particular issue. The references in these particular areas have some conflicting areas and confusion. Staff recommended text amendment changes on the October 16th Planning Commission meeting. At that meeting, riparian lot owners on Lake Minnetonka commented that these changes to the code did not meet their needs. The Planning Commission voted to continue the hearing to December and then to February today. During that period, staff had an opportunity to have two community meetings with Lake Minnetonka property owners. This produced constructive conversation and resulted in a majority of owners requesting particular language that clarified jurisdictional authority, particularly in the Lake Minnetonka Conservation District. This language is added to this version that's presented. Additionally, this ordinance was presented to the Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee. This committee reviewed each section and made recommendations for language changes to this draft ordinance. We received a number of comments, particularly through our two community conversations. They were thorough and quite thoughtful. We also received a number of emails, both with changes, but also with support, particularly to the LMCD, or the Lake Minnetonka Conservation District, and their purview over surface water uses on Lake Minnetonka. Staff recommends a motion to recommend to the City Council that they adopt the attached ordinance amending Chapter 28 and 109 of the City Code regarding docks. Some highlights for these changes include adding language that clarifies the LMCD as a sole regulating body on surface waters on Lake Minnetonka, highlighting the City of Victoria's one dock rule, adding to all residential zones docks as accessory uses, and removing additional conflicting language. With that, that concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to open it up for discussion among us. Did anybody have any initial questions or comments? I'll start with, this is just a cleanup issue. In former item E, which is now numbered F under, this is on page 3 of the draft ordinance. So starting with the middle of the page where we say footnotes and then section 28-27, structural regulations. We renumbered a bunch of those items. And so in the new item F, we make reference to exceptions to subsection D, which is now actually subsection E.
That change will be made.
Yeah, simple change, but just so we're referencing the right item. Any other comments or questions?
So it's just pretty much clean up.
Yeah, I think this has been a good process. I think that it's a little bit unique in that we've continued a public hearing for some time, but I think what that enabled was some good feedback through a number of neighborhood meetings. I think when I remember back at the last public hearing, it seemed like the most important distinction was just clarity around Lake Minnetonka as opposed to the remaining bodies of water throughout the city. And so I think with this adjustment, that seems to be pretty clear as written. Well, maybe we should open up for discussion. So I'll go ahead and open up the public hearing. And for any of those that would like to share any comments or have any questions, please step to the podium, state your name and address, and we'd love to hear your perspective. Anybody? All right, seeing none, I think that speaks to maybe the clarity that we've gained throughout this process. So I will go ahead and move that we close the public hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Any further discussion or care to make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to recommend approval of the amendments to Chapter 28 and Chapter 109 of the City Code regarding the docks.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Sounds like this will go forward then. I assume to the next city council meeting?
Correct.
All right.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda tonight then, which is another public hearing for the Hawks Point PUD amendment. Who's going to start us off?
Chair, if I may. Chair, commission members. Today I'd like to present a Hawks Point PUD amendment proposed to amend the ordinance to ordinance number 30393 to limit Lake Minnetonka access to lots 8 and 9 of Block 1 to the Hawks Point subdivision, to also to the legal owners and occupants of that particular lots. A little bit of background. Hawks Point was approved on September 14th, 2015 as a PUD and rezoning to Lake Minnetonka Residential District of lots located on Lake Minnetonka accessed from State Trunk Highway number 7 between Bay Creek Addition and the west and Bayview to the east. The subdivision features 15 lots, 2 of which, lot 8 and 9, are riparian lots on Lake Minnetonka. Staff reports and discussion regarding this PUD strongly favored lake access to be limited to the 2 riparian lots. A sketch plan dated July 14, 2014, which is Exhibit 2, illustrated as shared dock access on the east side of Lot 9. This was not included in the final plat. The staff report and the minutes from the Planning Commission meeting on September 1st of 2015 shows the Victoria Community Development Director, Landhauser, stated that no common dock will be available, so only the 2 lots on the Lake Minnetonka would be permitted to have docks. In addition, Director Landhauser discussed with the Planning Commission that a bluff line that runs along the west side of the subdivision will not have any impact and will not be permitted to do any building on that bluff. No language was written into the PUD that explicitly limited these rights. A request for additional Lake Minnetonka access through 6445 Hawks Point through a CUP for more than 1 dock and an easement for lake access along the west property line was brought to the Planning Commission on September 4th of 2018. There were public comments that argued against the permitting of the CUP, and for the Planning Commission and Council recommended revisiting docks in general. This update is to clarify the coding history of the Hawks Point development. Staff has prepared an amendment to the Hawks Point PUD ordinance that explicitly limits lake access rights to the riparian lots and not to be extended to any other lots or persons. Staff recommendation: staff recommends approval of an ordinance amending the Hawks Point PUD limiting access to Lake Minnetonka over lots 8 and 9 on Block 1, Hawks Point, that shall be limited to the owners and lawful occupants of those lots. And that's all.
Okay, thank you. Any initial questions or observations?
I think this is also cleanup. The last one was from past discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate staff's effort in looking back on the history and understanding the intent. I think that when the last Hawks Point proposal came before us, I think there was some context that was missing from that process, and I think that this adequately looked back. More clearly, I think, defines the context that was sort of the part of the original discussion and the original process, which I thought was a good process in terms of how we started with the sketch plat and had good dialogue with the developer at that time, and then ultimately ended up with a slightly different approach and final approval of that development. So, any other questions before we open it up for discussion? All right, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Again, if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to step up to the podium. All right, seeing none, I'll move that we close the public hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. I'll go ahead and move that we recommend approval of the ordinance amending ordinance number 393, limiting Lake Minnetonka access to riparian lots, Block 1, Lot 8, and Lot 9. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, again, this will move forward at the next planning.
Absolutely.
Sorry, the next city council meeting. So we'll go ahead and move on. Before we do, I know there's a lot of folks in the audience that have been a part of this process for these two public hearings. I just want to say thank you for your involvement and your contributions thus far. I think my hope is that we ended up at a good place, and that everybody, I think, contributed along this process. It's been a long process the last several months to get here, but thank you all for your contributions. So with that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the downtown parking study and comprehensive plan text and policies. Pat, you going to walk us through this one?
Yes. I was hoping everybody was going to stay for the parking study.
Yeah, of course, everybody's welcome to stay. There's lots of really good stuff here.
The parking study.
They're more interested in parking boats.
Chair, members of the City Council, or the Planning Commission, excuse me. The city's been discussing parking in downtown for over 30 years. The City Council recently appointed a task force made up of 10 members. The 2 City Council members, 2 Planning Commission members, Scott Stensland and Laura Moore, 3 residents, and 3 business people, basically to give a diverse viewpoint for the discussion. And as you could see, some of the input from the task force, it had a variety of viewpoints presented, as you can imagine. The task force met 3 times over the past year, and they've concluded with a parking study, and we go through that parking study results tonight. The study objectives were to collect and assess a sample of utilization counts for downtown Victoria to better understand the existing parking needs and the issues. Develop a parking tool to assess downtown Victoria's redevelopment assumptions and their impacts to the study area's parking supply. And then lastly, to establish strategies and recommendations that support a district-wide parking approach while fostering economic development initiatives. The task force objectives were to study the projected growth, parking demand, and parking supply in the downtown core area, and to make recommendations for city action, including financing of any recommended improvements and or changes to the parking ordinance that are consistent with the downtown master plan. Then these are the task force members. You can see them. The total parking supply in the downtown, there's 146 public spaces, and then and that's on-street, 146 on-street parking spaces, and then off-street there's 155 public spaces and 96 private spaces. So I should back up a little bit. So before we did the parking task force meetings, staff and one of the members of the Hoyson and Kogler went out and counted cars, basically at 10 o'clock, noon, and 6 o'clock. Basically the peak times in the morning, afternoon, lunchtime, and then at dinner time. And we did that on the weekends, and then we did one time on the weekend. So during the weekday at 10 o'clock, the green means that it was underutilized, so less than 74%. The yellow is monitor utilization between 75 and 84% utilized. The orange is approaching capacity at 85 to 92% utilized, and then red is at capacity, 93 to 100% utilized. So you can see here there's 3 areas that were at capacity around the clock tower building, and I think the area on the north side of the Rose Street parking lot on the weekdays. At noon, it got a little busier. You can see some more of the yellow, orange, up and down Quamaclit, again along Tower Boulevard, and along the alley there. And the parking lot in front of the tower. Oh, no, that's not the. Behind Floyd's. And then at nighttime on the weekends, or weekdays, I should say, it gets a little busier. Still a lot more green, but you can see a lot more red in the core downtown. We went out on a Friday evening after the borough was open to do counting cars again at 7 o'clock, just to see how it would compare with the borough being open. And you could see, again, on the district-wide, 73% of the parking on-street were being used. So that means 17% or 27% were still open. 90% of the off-street was being used. So that, again, means 10% of the off-street parking spaces were still open, for a total of 84% being used. Weekday utilization, this is the public is the blue, so that's the on-street parking, and also the public parking lots. Again, it ranges from at 10 and noon between 43 to 68, 54% in that area. So roughly half of the spaces are still available during the week, during the day. And then at night, it gets busier. At 64% of the public spaces being used, and then 76% of the entire district that includes the public and private spaces. On the weekends, looking at the 10 o'clock, it's pretty open all throughout the entire district. At noon, again, it's the Rose Street parking lot is a little busier, reaching capacity, but everything else is still pretty open on noons. And then at 6 o'clock on the weekends, it's filled in front of the Burroughs, the Rose Street parking lot, and most of the streets. But again, on the flats was underutilized. This is the findings from a graphic standpoint of the parking. Again, district utilization in the evenings was between 78 to 85%. So again, still, there's some capacity out there available. And I think one of the things that we found out that people are able to find a parking spot, but they do have to drive around a little bit, and they have to be willing to walk a little bit. So this is the conclusion of the utilization counts. There's not a parking supply issue during the morning and afternoon hours. Downtown is experiencing heavy parking demand during the evening hours. Public off-street parking at City Hall and flats were underutilized during all hours. In field observation, this is from staff and the consultant, determined that patrons are parking and walking a block or more to their destination. Traffic circulation did not seem to be an issue during the evening hours. And what he means by traffic circulation is that it didn't seem that cars were circling around trying to find a spot over and over and over again. They usually just drove around, not repeating the same spot, but actually finding a parking spot. Key items to consider when recommending a strategy, the urban form. And a lot of this comes down to the urban form, and is people are saying that we need more parking spaces, but when you put in more and more parking spaces, you become more of a Chanhassen, more of a suburban mall versus something that you want to be quaint. You want to be something walkable, and you have more of the public parking. And it's in the parking study, try to stress that is there's a lot of benefits of having the public providing the parking, especially on the street, because a lot of the uses that have different demands are able to share that parking. So the office has a different demand than retail. Retail has a different demand than restaurants. So you're able to use that parking, and you aren't wasting a lot of space on parking lots. So that's a kind of a key theme in the downtown master plan, and also in this discussion of how many parking spaces do you need and how many parking spaces do you actually want, because there's a fine line between providing too much and not enough. Another thing is walkability. So Scott, we just had him test it out. How far of a walk is it from here to the Ruby's Roast and from City Hall? And he walked it today in 2 minutes. So it's giving you an idea of how long, Starger Lake Lane parking spaces are usable if you're willing to walk 2 minutes. Urban Forum that we talked about earlier, this is the master plan for the downtown. Again, the master plan goal is to create a pedestrian-friendly community downtown. Huizen and Kogler did this little analysis of figuring out how much space is already dedicated to streets and parking lots. And you can see over 50% of the downtown's land is covered by roadways and parking lots currently. Again, this is just a image of showing what a walkable neighborhood downtown district is versus a suburban 100% parking for every use. This is what an 1/8 minute mile radius. So that basically says that within a 2-minute walking distance, it pretty much covers a good portion of downtown. And I think one of the neat things about this parking study is Huizen and Kogler created this public sector recommendations, private sector recommendations, and then the public-private, what they can do together. And so it kind of gives what can the city's responsible for, what's the private sector responsible for, and then what can we work together to resolve some of these issues. So they came up with 13 different strategies. Strategy 1 is utilization counts. So one of the recommendations is for staff to go out and monitor the utilization every other year. So just to get a benchmark of are we getting, how full are we getting? And as a way of documenting that. Wayfinding and signage. One of the things I've been working on, and I found out that they're going to be installed by the middle of March, are some parking lot signage. We've had a lot of discussions, comments saying that people can't find where the public parking lots are located. So we've had public parking lot signs designed, and they'll be installed in the middle of March. Parking restrictions, there's discussions on parking restrictions. Do we enforce the parking restrictions or not enforce the parking restrictions? Right now, we haven't been enforcing the parking restrictions. Strategy 4 is enforcement of technology. Technology meaning there's apps out there that are able, you could put sensors in the ground to let people know if there's a parking space available or not. I know the Mall of America is a good example. They've just installed a $1 million system where when you drive around there, you see the green light. That means is there a parking spot available there or a red light? So that kind of helps people navigate where those spots are. Maintenance, making sure our parking lots are maintained and attractive. Limiting liquor license was an idea that was suggested, but not necessarily recommended by the task force. Valet service would be something that would be a private service that would be done. Employee parking, again, this is more of a private sector side strategy, is having the employees parking away from the business district. Customer service, marketing where the parking spaces and lots are located. Planning Commission, you might be curious about this one. So what they recommended is having the Planning Commission be the kind of the body to keep this discussion going and what are the issues, what are some of the solutions, as opposed to having a task force. But this would be kind of the Planning Commission's bailiwick now. Urban Forum, again, trying to keep it pedestrian friendly. And then lastly, if things still need to be done, is some type of a parking structure. Again, the immediate action the task force is recommending is the wayfinding and signage and having the employees parking away from the businesses. Second level is the parking requirements in the urban form. Let's see, covered that. Parking structure. So the staff force recommended that the city explore the location and feasibility of the building and additional parking. If the city council chooses to begin a process of building more parking, the city should develop a district-wide parking model to address the financing, ownership, and maintenance of a future facility. The study provides guidance in tackling the roles and responsibilities of both the private and public sector. Next steps, continue the discussion. This is just the beginning. Parking needs to be part of the city's daily activities. We understand parking is a necessity for the businesses. Monitor utilization, as I mentioned. Start to identify the roles and responsibilities for a district-wide parking plan. Recognize that downtown parking in the comprehensive plan. So one of the things that we'd recommend is to try to, now that we did all this work and came up with a plan, did the study, is to kind of document some of these ideas and put them in the comprehensive plan. So there's a goal and then the priorities that would be recommended. First one is priority should be given to the pedestrian experience over parking by supporting connected sidewalks and development patterns that foster positive downtown experiences. 2, establish a system of wayfinding signage to help drivers located off-street parking facilities. 3, continue monitoring parking demands in the downtown on a biannual basis. 4, revise the parking ordinance to allowing existing tenant spaces to be used with permitted uses without providing additional parking except restaurants. And continue to provide a reduction in the parking requirements for new development, except for residential and for restaurants. 5, any significant development should include a parking study to determine the cost and need of a parking ramp. Maintenance costs of any parking ramp should be shared between the city and the local property owners. And then 6, ensure that any new parking structure should be designed to complement the architecture and urban form of the surrounding areas. So essentially what we tried to do with these 6 policy statements that would be in part of the comp plan is to summarize the findings in the parking study. So With that, I'll take any questions on the parking study or the recommended additions to the comprehensive plan.
Thank you. Anybody have any initial questions, thoughts?
If you don't mind, Pat, it seems odd to me that where the study included a lot of private parking and that our current local business issues appear to be with more of the local businesses that have opened up recently that require public parking. I noticed a couple of the lots that were counted are clearly not available for public parking right now, based upon the study and the maps that we've seen. That doesn't make sense to me.
That's a good question. I think what we did for the total utilization.
And even with the current study, what happens when our new 200-seat restaurant opens up here in a few months?
So that is the, what is it, the white elephant in the room or something like that, right? So, and that was discussed at the task force quite a bit, as you can imagine. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have staff, again, do these parking counts next year after that restaurant is open to see, well, what kind of input, what's the change from this year to next year in 2019, this summer, with this new restaurant open. I believe what they did, though, for the private parking is that we took the private parking out of the utilization counts. We counted them, but we didn't count them for the utilization because it is private parking and only certain people can park there. So to get the utilization counts, we looked at this public parking on the streets and the 4 parking lots, public parking lots.
Is part of the answer to John's question have to do with understanding what's there, even though it's not today, it's not part of the equation for access to parking, but having awareness of it as it stands today could potentially influence future solutions. In terms of if there were, because there were, for example, there were some strategies about, was it like valet parking? That even though some bank parking and some of the other businesses is considered private parking, could there be some partnerships in which, private partnerships in which a valet parking solution utilizes those non-public spaces during evening hours?
Right.
When restaurants need the parking and the service. So having an awareness of the cross-section of potential capacity is relevant.
Right. That's what we're hoping. That, and, part of the study is to hope that discussion starts so that people can take advantage of those empty parking, public or private parking lots.
It's an interesting study. I just don't necessarily agree with it. I'm concerned that as we continue to grow with the new businesses coming to town, it's going to have a huge negative impact on the existing businesses. I'm guilty. I'll drive one quick loop through town. If I can't park, I'll drive to Excelsior. Not that it's a whole lot better than us, but it's better than us right now. And I'm really concerned. I love the concept of our growth. I love the concept of our new businesses coming to town, but is this going to have a negative impact on our future growth with limited access and what the general public is generally complaining about privately and socially and publicly? Just seems to contradict the study we just reviewed.
I think when you look at the cost of providing more parking, it's $20,000 to $30,000 per stall. And so without having some type of redevelopment to occur to help finance that, it's very difficult for the city to build any parking structure right now without having that redevelopment. So I think that's one of the things that the task force looked at and said, let's look at this, but probably it's not an immediate fix, but a future fix. Provide more parking for the downtown, but how do we finance that and look at doing it as part of a redevelopment?
Thank you. That makes more sense. I misunderstood the study. My takeaway from the study was that we're good, everything's fine. I just disagreed with that.
I think the study is saying that everything's fine during the day, but at night, and especially on the weekends, it's getting close to capacity. But there's nothing. It's very difficult for the city, small it is to build a parking ramp out of the general fund because of the cost of building the parking ramps. Most of the parking lots, like at Edina and Wayzata, were built with some type of a collaboration with the private development finance that way. And that's what I think in the task force, I mean, it should be pretty clear that that is what is being recommended as well. So, like in number 5, any significant development, if we have any significant redevelopment in the downtown, we should look at doing a parking study to determine the cost and need of a parking ramp. So that's the time when you really look at it and say, okay, how much is this parking ramp going to cost? How much are we going to get in TIF to finance it? How much is the private developers going to pay? And how much is the city going to have to pay?
That makes sense. Thank you.
I have a question. The parking lot by Burroughs, is that limited use for only the customer of Burroughs after a certain hour, or can anyone park there?
It's signed for customers of Burroughs and customers of the clock tower.
Where's the clock tower?
The clock tower is that two-story apartment, or not apartment, two-story office retail building that is adjacent to that parking lot.
Cleaners and
Yep,
that kind of
cleaners,
stuff. Okay. At night, how many people go to the cleaners?
Well, I think the parking in front of that, all those businesses has been signed for those businesses only up until 4 or 5, basically when they're being used. And then the intent is to open it up to the borough customers after that.
Okay.
And that is a private parking lot, so that was an agreement worked out between the owner of the Burroughs and the owner of the clock tower.
I see. Thank you.
Pat, you mentioned when you started that with regard to the task force, there were a couple representatives from the downtown business community. And were you a part of those discussions as well?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm curious if maybe you could characterize a little bit, because it kind of seems like there's two main perspectives here, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying. There's more than that, but there's the perception by the customer and the resident, which is coming to the downtown, seeking access to services and business and restaurants and those types of things, right? But there's also the perspective of the business owner, which is making sure that parking is available so that they can maximize their business and their operations. Was their perspective stronger one way or the other in terms of, is it just a big problem from, or a concern from both perspectives equally, or is it more towards public perception and ease of access to finding a spot, or businesses feel like they're losing money because there's not enough parking to get people in the door?
Scott he was on the task force as well.
I think there's pain all around. I think everybody feels it. Business owners, citizens.
And I think so the 3 residents, you could probably characterize that they weren't as concerned with the parking downtown as the 3 business owners. Is that a pretty fair statement?
Yeah.
The 3 business owners were, we need parking and we need it now. Whereas the 3 residents were kind of saying, well, I could find a parking spot whenever I need to. It might not be right in front of the business that I'm going to, but I could still find a parking spot.
That's the catch.
Right.
I mean, it's a different mindset. It's not driving right up in front of your destination and hopping out of your car and popping in for a cup of coffee or dentist or whatever it happens, eyeglasses, whatever it happens to be. It's a bit of a walk.
And I did hear from one of the business owners, and he was very strong about disagreeing with the perspective that we're hearing this evening. He feels there's a very, very negative impact on his business.
Right. I think the business owners were the ones who were saying that we need more parking and we need it now. Definitely.
Yeah, and they're certainly concerned with when the creamery, the new business opens.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
I did have another question with regard to, there's a lot of strategies here that I think are dependent on partnership among public and private, both business owners and the city. Which I think is important because it seems like there's some key things that both parties can do relatively quickly. But what I was wondering, with regard to your comment about the Planning Commission potentially carrying the torch forward with regard to evaluating strategies, was there much discussion among the group in terms of what that looks like? Right, so in terms of that level of engagement, if this is the group that starts exploring strategies, it likely requires having a seat at the table with business owners and sort of having dialogue about, I mean, recognizing that things still go to city council for ultimate agreement, but in terms of understanding how those dialogues can happen in a productive manner, in terms of understanding what the city's perspective, what the city might be willing to contribute, but also what the expectations are from the city's side in terms of what business owners are contributing to the solutions.
I sort
Maybe
of,
a more procedural thing than anything.
yeah, I sort of assumed that was kind of the consultant's recommendation, because I don't think we ever discussed that as a group, or maybe we did discuss it briefly, but I think he did throw it out once when he was talking, but we didn't dive into how that works, what that looks like.
So how would it work, like how it would function is, one of the things that staff would, part of it is just looking at the parking counts every other year. You know, staff would do the counts, present it to the planning commission, the planning commission look at it and, you know, try to figure out, you know, parking, is it getting worse or is it getting better? Just another way of talking about it is I attend the Victoria Business Organization meetings, monthly meetings, and so I'm starting to have a discussion with them of parking. As staff, I could be the conduit between the business association and the planning commission, or if the planning commission wanted to get in more of an active role, they can always set up a subcommittee and meet with business owners as well. That's how I kind of see it moving forward. But essentially, somebody's got to be the torchbearer if this is going to get done. And instead of having a task force be the torchbearer, we were suggesting to have the planning commission do that.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with the approach or the philosophy. I just think that so many of these strategies are going to require sort of a balance of commitment, either in terms of commitment of funding or commitment of taking action, you know, shared among both parties. And so making sure that those discussions are enabled to be productive is, I think, important. So,
You know, when you talk about the biannual studies, kind of looking further out, what about in respect to, I'm sure someone in here knows, or someone on, you know, when Winchester and Rye is going to open. I mean, I would think within 30 days after that new business opens, we're going to have a pretty good idea what's happening with parking down here. I don't think it's going to take very long.
Mm-mm.
Are we taking that into consideration?
We can. We could start the parking counts. You kind of want to do them on a regular basis, like the same night and the same day of the year, so you have a really good comparing the apples to apples. Then you know if things are getting worse or better.
And I respect that totally, but the sense, a big sense that I got from the meetings that I attended, especially from the current business owners, is this is going to change things in a hurry soon. And what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, that's why we could do that.
Yeah,
Month after it opens.
When is that supposed to open? Does anybody know?
I don't know.
This spring.
Is it spring? Okay.
Yep.
It'd be fun to do another count in June when Classic Car Night's going on, that's full on, everything else is going on, everybody's downtown.
well, I don't know that. I mean, Classic Car Night's an anomaly.
Right.
Is it enough?
But it's,
And you know what you're getting when you.
That just seems like a very unique event, that there's sort of a shared understanding among the city, the community, and the business owners that, you know, that is drawing, that's not business as usual.
think that's very true.
So it doesn't seem fair that that would be used to characterize, I mean, you're creating an event, you're creating very unique situations in terms of parking availability in non-traditional places. I'll just leave it at that.
Yep.
But
Very good point.
I also wonder, is there a seasonal aspect to this?
That's kind of what I was trying to get to. It just didn't.
I mean, do
explain it
we,
as well.
aside from some of the anomalies like major events in which, we're trying to attract a large group of people from a broader region and then adapt policies and availability of things in terms of where people park and people are walking from neighborhoods. And I think there's a different tolerance and understanding when a major event like that is happening. But in terms of when it is business as usual, are the summer months different than, cold week in January or February? My sense is probably yes, but I don't know that.
So the intent of the parking counts is to try to figure out the times that are going to be used most heavily to find out what the capacity is. And that's why we did them over the summer period, summer months, and then that one Friday after the boroughs open. But yeah, we can always, just for information purposes, do a parking counts during February or something, just for comparison. That'd be easy.
Pat, do you know how many parking spots are in the flats right across from us?
35.
35, okay.
And that's for public spaces. And
I
there's-
understand it, and the signs are going up. I know it's not a solution, but it was interesting, and you pointed it out there. That is never utilized. Personally, I never knew that was public parking, and I know it's only 35 spots, but I think that'll make a huge difference down here once there's some signs guiding people right into that. It's natural to think, oh, this is parking for people that live here.
Not only that, but over the summer and fall, the lights weren't on Starga Lake Lane. So even though the street was open for a long period of time, the street lights weren't installed. So that makes a big difference too, just making that visible for parking and for safety and walking.
I'll just ask another question out of curiosity for those that sat in on those meetings. So some of these strategies, particularly when you get to maintenance of parking areas, expansion of parking areas, more parking ramp, for example. From the business owner's perspective that was on those committee, was there sort of a willingness expressed to go those routes in which, some of the investment is high, and I know there's a range of options in terms of how you might implement those with regard to TIF or other incentives with development, but with regard to existing business owners, is it a strong enough pain point in which there seems to be a willingness to contribute to part of the solution from a financial standpoint?
Well, I would say there's a couple of people on the task force that said we don't need a parking structure at all. So again, I don't think there was anything that was, maybe two of the recommendations were unanimous, but there's a variety of viewpoints for all the other recommendations. But I think what the people who did recommend building ultimately a parking structure recommended some type of a combination of public-private partnership, not only in funding it, but also the maintenance of it, because the maintenance costs are pretty high as well.
So do we think this process worked? And I ask that because I hear John's concerns that he may not agree with some of the findings. Do we think there was opposing views, but that's why you create a cross-section, because you appreciate everybody's diverse viewpoints. But do we think that with regard to the study that we have in front of us and the findings, is it a good representation of, to me, I see it as it's aspirational goals, which is very much consistent with the comprehensive plan in terms of some options and some goals looking ahead where we might go. Well, my sense is that there's opposing views on a variety of those things. Did it work?
Are you asking me?
Well, I'm asking for, those of you that participated, you might not agree with all of it, But some of you who participate on this committee also participated in like a long-term comprehensive plan process, and there's probably aspects of that that you strongly agree or disagree or strongly disagree with. So, but sort of putting it in that context, if we're being asked to recommend this being incorporated into the long-term comprehensive plan, do we think that the process is consistent with that in terms of consensus building and a broad range of ideas for consideration?
Do you want to start? And I'll-
Well, I do. I think you're right that the process with the parking testers, I'm not sure we came out with silver bullets. According to this plan, we have a parking problem on weekends, late on weekends, but there's a lot of parking spaces. And, personally, I agree with that. I'm a walker. I don't mind walking, and I know where more parking spots are because of the flats, so you kind of learn where the spots are. But I certainly feel for people who are new to the city and just drive in and can't park. And I feel for those business owners where that's a challenge. It's a big challenge. And I think the comprehensive plan, I think those are good goals, and I think it does address it. But I'm still afraid of the very near future, this spring, what's going to happen.
I would say it was a success. I'm always thinking, how can things be done differently, the process be done differently? And one of the things you could have done differently was to have more of a public outreach, talk to the more residents, more business owners. But on the other hand, I also think that we had a pretty good cross-representation on the task force. And so even if you had more discussions with the public, I think the ultimate various views would still be the same and differ. And I think parking it's probably one of the more challenging issues any small town city faces. Because like I said, it's a fine line between providing enough parking for the businesses to succeed, but not providing too much that you're ruining that walkability. So it's not easy. And I think the other thing that the parking, why this is successful in my mind is it just starts the discussion of what can we do, what can't we do because of financial issues too. And $20,000 to $30,000 a parking stall is not cheap. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we approved the borough, didn't they have to prove that they had enough parking spaces for their facility?
yes, they did. And they completed a parking study, and they showed how the parking in the clock tower building and the parking for the borough would offset and kind of complement with each other.
I wasn't here when the creamery, did they come before us?
They did as well. And
Did they have to prove that they had enough parking spaces?
right.
Where were they?
Well, a lot of it was, and this is before my time, so this is
Also,
right, is that they created a lot of the parking. I believe they created a lot of the parking around that building that wasn't there before, on-street parking.
but not 200 places.
If-
Or divide by 4, table of 4,
Right, probably not to
50 places.
probably not to accommodate all their demand. But again, that's what, you going back to this parking ratio and
Yeah.
how many parking spaces do you want these restaurants? And that's why one of the recommendations for this is basically saying, right now, going forward, we wouldn't allow any more restaurants unless they provided all the parking.
Thank you.
Because the restaurants are the ones who really drive the demand.
Okay.
So, having said all that, I'm wondering if, so you're seeking a recommendation, essentially to recommend to the city council to adopt the to adopt this study into the comprehensive plan?
Not necessarily the study, but these 6 objectives that are in front of you. Basically a summary of the parking study. How do we move forward?
Okay. So that's where I was going with that, was it feels like the process worked. There's a good diversity of viewpoints and perspective, though not widespread consensus on necessarily. But I like, there's some recommendations for some strategies which are near term and tangible. Would it be? It also feels though like the conversation needs to continue. Mm-hmm. And so in the study, it's recommending, for example, strategy. There's, I think, 2 strategies that were strongly recommended to implement immediately. But I'm wondering if that strategy number 11 with regard to the Planning Commission being the forum, sort of in some ways accountable to continue to monitor the situation, continue to identify those items which require more exploration, more discussions, more engagement with businesses, residents. Is it practical to incorporate that to the recommendation to go to City Council? That be, I think, thought of and recommended to move forward with that as a...
Like a bullet point here, like a number 7?
Right.
A little more specific.
I mean, I guess that's what I'm saying, is that these might be included in the comprehensive plan, but it feels like the way to sort of move the conversation forward is to explore what that means in terms of continuing the discussion in the forum of the Planning Commission.
You can definitely add that as number 7. I think it is an important point to continue the conversation with the Planning Commission with this.
I mean, because without clarity around that, then we're lacking consensus and we're lacking, I guess, a focus towards what's the appropriate means to continue to evaluate, continue to review. I think some of the steps in here, doing counts, utilization counts is important, but only important if you do something about it and review it and decipher it and understand what it means and understand when it was done and what's the seasonal impacts. I mean, there's a range of things, but a number of these other strategies, I think, just really rely on action. And so how do you focus that review and create a forum for taking the right action that weighs in evolving viewpoints and evolving conditions? Because the parking study is a snapshot in time, right? And so we've got to carry it forward.
You could add in the number 7 as saying the Planning Commission would be the responsible party to implement the strategies as recommended in the parking study in that date. And I could easily see staff, every other month having a discussion with the Planning Commission. Where are we at these different strategies?
How do you guys feel about that?
I like it because it addresses kind of the near term and puts some guidance to all this, how we're gonna move forward with that.
Both near term and long term, because
Yeah.
a lot of this is going to take some work, and it's going to take some work over time. Mm-hmm. And it takes I don't know that this was presented as like the final word, because there's so much here in the parking study that talks about next steps and vision and implementation and those kinds of things, but it just sort of formalizes how to go about that. Okay. Any other questions or discussion items on this one?
I'm good.
Good.
Pat, are you looking for a motion, recommendation?
Yes, a motion on the recommended language to be added in the comprehensive plan with the one addition.
So I'll go ahead and make a motion that we recommend to the city council that they adopt the proposed comprehensive plan text and policies with the additional bullet point of number 7, recommending that planning commission continue or function as an evaluation of strategies and ongoing dialogue with various stakeholders. You can wordsmith that a little bit, but is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you. Appreciate all that perspective. So we'll move on to the next item then, which is actually another public hearing, and this one's for a conditional use permit for parking at 7924 Victoria Drive.
Mark Hubner is the owner of Noble Lion, and which is located at the corner on the northern part of the Main Street building on Victoria Drive. He's proposing to use some vacant space in the Noderman building, which is highlighted here in yellow, as kind of a waiting room. There's an interior space that's behind Ruby's Roost. It's about 800 square feet, and what he is seeing in his business is that a number of people are waiting for tables, and they're going to other places to have drinks while they wait for the tables. And when they get the text that their table is ready, they usually have to, finish up their drink, pay their bill, and then head over. And it adds a number of, so the tables are essentially being open and waiting for these people to come back. And so what he would rather have is kind of a waiting room across the alley, that patio area, that people can go there, wait for their tables, and then not even have to pay up, but just have that bill be added on to their bill at the restaurant. So it would kind of make his whole restaurant function that much better than having people go scattered throughout town. What we did when we looked at this, here's the Ruby's Roost coffee shop, and then here's the proposed. It's called the Lion's Den space. And what we did here was we looked at when the space was last fully occupied in 2014, and looked at the parking that was required at that time, and then compared it to what the space is being used now. And so in 2014, when it was last fully leased, it would require 47 parking spaces. Upper floor was used for an office, main floor was used for a daycare, and the lower floor, the basement, was used for an office and a dance studio. And today, the upper level is used as an office, so that's kind of a wash. Main floor is used for retail, and then the bakery, Ruby's Roost, and the lower level is used for retail and office. So today's, with the proposed restaurant, it would require 55.59 parking spaces. If you subtract what was used when it was fully leased, it leaves a difference of 8 parking spaces. And then if you use the city's ordinance currently allows a 50% reduction, it reduces it to requiring 4 parking spaces for this little waiting room restaurant addition. Through a conditional use, the city council is able to waive any parking requirements if they pay a parking fee. And the parking fee for the Creamery in 2017 was $5,000 per spaces. So if they're required 4 parking spaces, they would have to pay a total of $20,000. And that $20,000 would go into helping with the parking situation in the downtown, either parking signs or providing parking spaces in the future. For a conditional use permit is required to enable this entire thing to occur. There's 4 criteria for findings for a conditional use permit. First one is the establishment Maintenance or operation of the conditional use will not be detrimental to or endanger the public health, safety, morals, comfort, or general welfare. Staff finds that the proposed use, being limited in size and 831 square feet, will not be detrimental to or endanger the public health, safety, morals, or comfort, or general welfare. Second one is the proposed use at that particular location requested is necessary or desirable to provide a service or a facility which is in the interest of the public convenience and will contribute to the general welfare of the community or neighborhood. The proposed restaurant, or waiting room, is a good use of the space that is not readily visible from either the Victoria Drive or the parking lot. So it's kind of a hidden area, and it probably wouldn't be used very for anything else that relies on heavy traffic. So having this part of the Noble Line is a good use because it will attract people just because it's already part of the Noble Line. The location will be convenient to the customers of the Noble Lion that are waiting for seating. Third, the establishment of the conditional use will not impede the normal or orderly development and improvement of the surrounding property for uses permitted in the district. The parking study that we just discussed showed that there was still available parking on the weekend nights, even though some customers didn't need to drive around to find the open parking spaces. Now, there's also the elephant in the room is the creamery, and it may change. But as now, the application for this conditional use permit is for tonight, and looking at the parking study with the creamery not there, you can only really evaluate it based on the given, what is out there today. Fourth, the conditional use shall in all other respects conform to the applicable regulations of the district in which it is located. The proposed use as a restaurant waiting room is a permitted use in the central business district. No changes to the building are required except for a future sign for the business. With that, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission recommend the City Council approve the conditional use permit for the Lions Den located at 7924 Victoria Drive, subject to the condition that the applicant pay $20,000 into a parking fund prior to issuance of a building permit. With that, I'll take any questions. Otherwise, the property owner and the restaurant owner are here as well.
Thanks, Pat. I just want to start with a clarification because I'm not sure that's fair what you just stated in terms of what you describe as the elephant in the room. We've got a business which isn't open for business yet, but it's come before the Planning Commission. It's been approved as a conditional use. There's a building permit on record. I don't think it's fair to say that we can't consider a business that just hasn't opened its doors yet in the context of this discussion. I'm not suggesting that steers the conversation, but I just don't think it's a fair statement to say that we, as a Planning Commission, shouldn't be considering that business because it's all on the books. It's a known entity, and we know its situation, and we know what the required parking is associated with it. So I think it is an assumed existing condition.
I think it's different having the application now versus submitting the application for this after the creamery was open. I think that's my point, is that It is very different.
I think it'd be fair to characterize it that there may be some fear or some concerns expressed by various parties that the burden on the downtown parking situation could be more than maybe what has been anticipated. Meaning, like, we've done the parking counts, we've done the parking study, we understand how many spaces have been allocated for the future business of Winchester and Rye. I think we have to take that into account. But the additional part of the fear of it actually drawing more business than what has been planned for, or more demand for parking, that's what's been allocated. I think you're right. We shouldn't be contemplating those fears that business is wildly successful beyond its current demand. Well, we know it's going to be there, and we know how many parking spaces have been allocated for that business to function. Is that a fair
Yes.
starting point in terms of the context that we're talking?
Good clarification.
Now's the time for valet parking. People come for a nice dinner, not have a hassle ahead of time or afterwards. That's up to the restaurant owner, not up to us, but I love valet parking.
I'll just share an initial reaction, and I'll be interested to kind of continue this discussion as we go with public, with the public hearing and otherwise. But this seems like a really good solution. I have an appreciation for the business owner in terms of the perspective of, how to accommodate customers and how do you accommodate them in a way that isn't pushing them off to other businesses and sort of, like the shared waiting room idea where, go wait at another business and then I'll call you over. So I think that this proposal solves that. I think that this is likely a really attractive scenario and an attractive situation. Mm-hmm. But it also feels like the way it's most successful is if it truly is considered like supplementary or complementary as a waiting room, right? If it's actually drawing additional patrons to the business, is it during peak periods, evenings and weekends? If the waiting room is full of patrons that aren't intending to dine at the Noble Lion, it may potentially compound the problem. These types of spaces may be desirable. They're, it's sort of like the best kept secret sort of scenario. So that was like my initial reaction. So it made me wonder is there a scenario in which, it sounds like it's intended to be open for all, not just open for those who check in at the Noble Lion. And if you're going to wait, then go over and have a drink, have some snacks, that sort of thing. But is there a scenario in which that is advantageous, where during peak periods like evenings, let's just say evenings, weekend evenings and weekday evenings, where the intended function of the space is a waiting room for the patrons of the Noble Lion, so it's not adding additional parking demand. But during non-evening hours, it's open to the broader public. Now that's totally a gray area, and I'm not trying to stick my nose in the business of others, but when I was thinking about the struggle between the parking and the demand and the goal for the business to operate in a more optimal way and contribute, that I'm just sharing that as that seems like a potential good balance. Now I don't know how you'd structure that, and we can talk more about that, but I just wanted to share that perspective.
They have a very large kitchen planned. It seems to me that in a lot of high-top tables, it's going to be a destination for a snacky type dinner too.
My initial thought was whether they're waiting or those people I think they're going to be downtown anyways. Mm-hmm. And whether they go to the Noble Line and there's a 30-minute wait and they go elsewhere, they're probably just leaving their car wherever it was parked initially and walking somewhere else. So that's how I thought of it initially. It doesn't, like you, I think it's a great solution for that business, especially like you said, that location. It's kind of a walk by, you'd never even notice it. And it's so close. You think about summertime with the lights out there, it's going to be beautiful. And the people are going to be there anyways. Seems like a win-win,
Yep.
personally.
I agree. I think it's a great use of space. I applaud the applicant for agreeing to contribute to the parking fund, contribute the issues you already have. The last thing I want to see with our growth and our lack of parking is limit the successful business partners we currently have today. They're great partners with our community. I may have been frequent at the restaurant a time or two. It's fantastic. He's been a great business partner, and I hope we can keep him happy and help him grow.
That's nice.
Any other comments or questions before we open it up for public hearing? All right, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. If anybody has any thoughts or comments, please state your name and address at the podium.
Well, I am the accused owner, Mark Hibner from the Noble Lion. Kind of ironic that this falls like right after the parking commission.
Lucky you.
You noticed that too.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? But I've been hearing what you're saying, and obviously I've been contemplating this for a long time. I thought about doing this last March. Went to a banker, went to a mentor, and they just said, I haven't been open long enough. And actually, my banker thought it was a good idea because I was throwing money out the window, giving it to other businesses. And that wasn't really my concern. My concern was keeping people coming to the restaurant without them getting discouraged. You go to other restaurants downtown, they are larger venues, they have a separate bar where people can wait, and I wanted to create that environment. I did type a 2-page description of the venue, and I'm not sure if you read it, but Mary Jo, you made a comment about valet parking. I've already spoken with a local business owner who has a parking lot and has no qualms about me using that lot on a Friday and Saturday for valet parking. I don't feel I should bear the burden for the rest of the city so I can free up spots for everybody else's patrons. And I think it would be a very logical thing to do to go into business with another restaurant. And I would love to do it with Winchester and Rye. They have the perfect location where there's 3 stalls on that west side where you could pull right in. And then we could both have our customers valeted. Speaking to, am I going to draw more customers? My customers are already here. Scott said they're going to park, and if they can't get in, they're just going to go somewhere else. That somewhere else may be the Lion's Den, it may be Winchester Rye, maybe the Burroughs. What I'm experiencing now is that I send people to other establishments, and we use an app called Waitlist, and every week I get a report, and it's usually Friday and Saturday, and it'll tell me how many people I waitlisted. I am averaging every Friday 58 people and every Saturday 77 people with an average wait of 32 minutes. So that's how many people have parked in the streets, come there and said, we are willing to wait for you. They come from Woodbury, Stillwater, Prior Lake, Wayzata, Orono. These aren't the locals. The feedback I get from the parking from them is they can't find a spot, and that goes back to me, signage. They drive around that simple circle, around the creamery, and they can't find anything. They have no clue Rose Street will be there. I think once parking signs are there, that's going to help alleviate some of that parking. Going back to having my people wait, if the average wait is a half an hour, what I'm experiencing is that we send them a text, they're halfway through their cocktail, they can't get paid out because the other establishments are busy, and it takes them on average 15 minutes to come to my table. So if I take 10 tables times 15 minutes, that's 150 minutes. That's 2.5 hours of time I'm looking at a table where I could have people sitting there, and that's 2.5 hours longer these particular cars are sitting in the parking lot. So by me being able to usher them in and out quicker, I'm also getting them in and out of Victoria quicker. I'm not trying to have a hurried dining experience, but I also want to, keep all the customers happy. The Lion's Den will have a kitchen. It's not as big as you may think it is. It's half the size of my kitchen I currently have, which is 400 square feet, which is tiny in comparison to other restaurants.
I was just looking at the.
Yeah. So ideally, you're right. It's going to be small plates. We're going to do some different cocktails. All my current regulars, they tell me they'll go over there. I'm going to have TVs over there. They'll go over there, watch those games, or hang out over there. They're sitting for 3 and 4 hours at the Noble Lion on a Friday night. That's 2 groups of people that I can bring in for the time that they're spending there. So that is going to speed up the turn as well, because now those people who are driving a half an hour are going to come, they're going to park, and, I got to wait 10 minutes. Is there a spot at your bar? Yes, there's a spot at my bar. Then they literally turn around, take their drink, and sit at their table. So it's all about efficiencies to me. Whether it's taking them across the alleyway with their drink in hand. They can't walk across the city street with a drink in their hand, right? But they can across the private alley. So it's all about creating a much more unique and, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of just a cohesive, atmosphere, an environment. You go, some people want to sit at the bar and have a cocktail for 20 minutes before they get sat at their table because they're meeting friends, but I can't even allow them to do that. And you can imagine in February when it's blowing snow, nobody wants to walk back across the street when they've already just walked 3 or 4 minutes from their car, because you walk much slower in the winter, as we know, in the snow. So that's really what I'm trying to look to do here. Is if White Birch House had gone out of business. I could apply for that space, and it's right next door. It's not across the alley. I'd be working off the same kitchen, and I would put more seats in than I would be putting in. And I don't know if it would be that big of an argument then, considering it's technically adjacent. No different liquor license. The only reason this is up is because I require a different liquor license because it's a different property ID, unless we build a tunnel between the two. So, yeah, that's
Make it big enough for a parking garage too.
yeah, couldn't we? Shouldn't we? So, but I think parking signs are going to help, and I think that me being able to turn people, and then if we can explore the opportunity of just weekend valet, you know, I mean, I think if we can move 30, 40 cars and put them in a private lot, that frees up a lot of parking, and I'm willing to do that and help to contribute with that. So, if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Anybody else have any thoughts? All right, seeing none, then I'll go ahead and move that we close the public hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, any additional discussion, questions?
It is interesting just following our parking discussion. But I think it's a great idea.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I do think it's a strong idea. I think that some of my opening comments had as much to do with, you know, my sense that there's concerns and fears surrounding the parking situation, and so how do you proactively account for that? And it sounds like whether it's valet, whether it's some of the actions that the city is taking to address it. And we're talking about based on the calculations, a difference of four parking stalls.
That's correct.
So. It's good. Anybody willing to formulate a motion?
I can do that. I make a motion to recommend the city council approval of the conditional use permit for the Noble Lions Den located at 7924 Victoria Drive, Suite 102, subject to the following condition. The applicant pay $20,000 into the parking fund prior to the issuance of the building permit.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, next city council meeting, right?
Yep.
All right, so we'll keep moving here. Next on the agenda is the sketch plan for Vogel Gestach. How do I pronounce that last name? I'm sorry.
Gestach.
Gestak. I'm sorry. I should know that by now, but when I see it on paper, it just wasn't quite there for me. So, thank you, Pat. You're going to walk us through this one.
Yes. Mike Sewell is representing D.R. Horton. They have a purchase agreement with both Mr. Gestach and Mr. Vogel to develop a property that's located on County Road 11 on the west side. Mr. Gestach owns the top rectangle piece and then this little L piece, and Mr. Vogel owns the little rectangle piece on the bottom. The property is located in Laketown Township and will need to be annexed. Staff has been working with the Township Board on the annexation, and the City Council directed staff at their last meeting to start the annexation process. It's always kind of fun to go through the different iterations since the D.R. Horton has had this under contract. This was before I even started working here at the city. They came in with a concept that was all single-family homes. The next concept added the urban row house townhomes because some of that area was guided for high density and medium density single family in the draft 2040 comprehensive plan. The third iteration came in because they removed some of the high density. They still wanted to keep the net density higher to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So they included more row homes in that north area. And then what you see today is, again, a different iteration, and that is that they're providing two different types of row homes. So you're going to have a variety of row homes. You have express family, which is kind of your villa type development, and then the single family. There's 73 single family lots and 77 express villa lots. I'll just go through. I'll go back to the site plan a little bit, but just to give you an idea of what is being proposed, the different type of architecture and type of units. So that these would be your typical single family homes. This is the kind of look for the express lots or the villas, so 1 story in nature. And then this is the kind of an idea for the urban townhomes. So just kind of go through here. There'd be a right-in, right-only access on the north side of the development, and a full access on the south side. There's a park, and it's centrally located. There's trails along County Road 11, and then through the park, and then there's also a trail that would connect to the future development to the south. As I mentioned in the staff report, that trail does cross a wetland and would have to be approved by the county water management organization. The other thing that they had done, the request of the staff, was before they had this as a cul-de-sac, and I believe this one as a cul-de-sac too. We were recommending that because of the length of the cul-de-sacs, that they turn them into future through streets. So when the property to the north and to the west get developed, those won't be cul-de-sacs anymore. They'll be more through streets. One of the big discussions in the staff report, at least, is the side yard setbacks. What they are recommending is side yard setbacks of 8 feet for both the single family lots and also the express lots. And you can see in the staff report the number of developments that have been approved recently since 2013. Vast majority of those have been at 10-foot side yard setbacks and 80-foot width. What they're proposing is, again, 70 feet width and 8-foot setbacks.
But the total density is 4 units per acre,
Correct.
including the park.
Well, that's net density. So if you take out the parks, the wetlands, and the steep slopes, the net density is over 4 units per acre, and that includes the townhomes as well.
4 units per acre that they're building on.
Correct.
I got it.
This map I just wanted to show is I got this today. It wasn't in your packet. But one of the questions that staff had raised in the staff report is just the functionality, usefulness of the park land. As mentioned, a typical neighborhood park is between 5 and 8 acres, and staff is recommending that this development would provide the neighborhood park for both the developments, this one and the Welter property to the south. And because of that, we need at a minimum of 5 acres usable space. What they're showing here is kind of a study showing that 6.4 acres would be usable. Again, we would like just to make sure that that is sufficient for the Park and Rec Commission. They'll probably meet next month. They had a meeting, I think it was scheduled today, but it was canceled due to lack of quorum. But they'll have that discussion and make sure that that is consistent with what their vision is for the park. This table I just want to highlight. It's in your staff report as well, but just the difference between the single-family R1 zoning district standards and the single-family R2 standards. Minimum lot area in the R1 is 12,000 square feet. The minimum lot area in the R2 is 7,500 square feet. Minimum lot width is 80 feet, is what we typically would see in the last 10 years. Minimum lot width in the R2 is 60 feet. Front yard setback is 30 feet in R1, R2 is 25 feet. Rear yard setback is the same. Side yard setback, that's the difference of 10 and 8. And then the maximum impervious surface does go up from 35% to 40% in the R2. They're trying to come up with some good examples for the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council to figure out, what does an 8-foot side yard setback look like for a single-family development. And really, we've only had 3 projects approved with 8-foot side yard setbacks. One is Cheval, which was part of the Chaska development. But if you look at that, and I pulled a number of surveys, none of those were ever built at 8 feet, 8 feet. There was one was built at 8 feet, but on both sides of that, both the homes had greater distances than 8 feet. So ultimately, you had still a setback that exceeded the 16 feet between homes. Then Meadows of Wasserman, there's a couple houses that are under construction, and then Lake Town 11th that still has no homes constructed. So it really isn't a good example in Victoria. So then I asked Chaska. I called the city planner there. I said, do you have any examples of developments that have full-size single-family homes with 8-foot setbacks? They gave me 2 examples that they have approved. One is in Red Cedar Creek. They have setbacks of 7.5 feet. And the other one is at Club West, and they have side yard setbacks of 7 feet. Again, just looking at the aerial, it looked like Red Cedar Creek homes were kind of offset. So they didn't have the full width of a house that was 7.5, 7.5. But you can see from the aerial that Club West, those houses were taking up the entire lot with the side yard setbacks. So I went and took some pictures, and I mentioned in the staff report that I didn't have time to take these pictures last Friday, but I did today. So this is the difference, and this is 7-foot setbacks between single-family homes. And it looks pretty tight. This is 7-foot setbacks between single-family homes from the rear. This one on the left, that's being separated by a road. So that's why it has a greater setback than these other ones. So with that, staff is recommending that the city keep the side yard setbacks at 10 feet for single-family homes. If the Planning Commission and the City Council ultimately wanted to reduce the side yard setbacks to something that is more with what the developer is recommending, staff would recommend doing a side yard setback of like 10 feet and 8 feet or 10 feet and 7 feet. And so this is a typical single-family home. It's not always built this way or designed this way. But what you could do is have a side yard setback that's less than 10 feet on the garage side. Because the garage sides usually don't have windows, and the garage side is usually stepped down from the scale of the home. So if you did a 10-foot and 7 feet, that 7 feet would be on the garage side, or a 10-foot, 8 feet. So if you do a 10 and 8 or 10 and 7, you're at a total of 18 feet or 17 feet versus the 16 feet that they're requesting. So it does, it's a foot or 2 more, but I think that foot or 2 makes a big difference. Similar to the Vassar development, we approved that development with 8-foot setbacks, but we also included a height limit so that those villas that were 1 story wouldn't be able to be built 20, 30 years. Somebody couldn't pop off the top of the roof and make it a 2-story building, ultimately. That Vassar development would be consistent with this express proposals that they have. So the other thing that to discuss is the collector street and residential streets. So residential streets in your typical streets in front of everybody's homes, they have parking on both sides of the street, and it has no limitations on access. So that's where most of the homes would access those residential streets. A collector street is your typical through street where you want to have most of the traffic traveling. And because of that, they limit access to those collector streets. And they typically don't have any homes fronting a collector street. Those collector streets are pretty expensive to build because as a developer, they're building the streets, they're paying for the streets, but they don't have many lots that help pay for those streets. So what we're recommending is kind of a hybrid that would go through this neighborhood. And it also is consistent with our comprehensive plan that had this kind of a neighborhood collector street. And that is, it comes in from the full access in the middle of the development, and then it goes north and south. And you can see on this one, the very limited access on that neighborhood collector until you get to the north part where they have these express lots. And even then, they have a cul-de-sac, so again, it limits the number of access onto that collector street. One of the things that we'd recommend, though, is along that collector street, also in keeping with limiting access, is to have lots that are wider than normal. So instead of 80 feet, to have 85-foot lots. And then because it's a collector street or neighborhood collector street, and there's going to be more traffic, that have the front yard setbacks deeper than typical at 40 feet instead of 25 feet or 30 feet, and then have the lots deeper. Again, this is a more of a guideline than a standard. So one of the things that we'd recommend right now, they're at 66 feet, is to eliminate one lot, so you get closer to the 85-foot standard, or guideline, I should say. But even then, it's not to the 85 that staff would recommend, but at least they're getting closer to that 85 lot width. The last item I just wanted to highlight is it's kind of tough to look at this picture here, but they do have sidewalks on each one of the residential streets, except for this little stub street that's going to go to the Schmieg property to the north someday. Staff is recommending adding a sidewalk to that length of the street because it will extend and will be used. Staff is also recommending they have two sidewalks on these two cul-de-sacs, to put those on the north side of the cul-de-sac just because of sun, for the reasons of melting sidewalks during the wintertime versus on the south side. And not only that, but I think, again, it's difficult to see. There's one on the lots, I can't see, but where the lot has a sidewalk on the side, but not the front. And so it's kind of asking that property owner in the future to snowplow the side of the property, but never having to have the front. So if you flipped it on the other side of the street, the other property owner would have to shovel or snowplow both the front and the sides, which makes sense. So with that, the sketch plan is the time for the Planning Commission to provide feedback to the developer before they're making plans for the preliminary plat submittal. No formal action is taken. Staff is supportive of the concept plan and believes that the developer should be complimented for the variety of housing types in the development, having 4 different housing types in that 30-acre development. That's is a positive. And meeting the overall density of the 33 units per acre of the cities. Staff listed a number of conditions that the Planning Commission may want to discuss, change, delete, or add to. With that, I'll take any questions. Otherwise, the developer is here too, wants to make a presentation or answer some questions.
Thanks, Pat. Discussion? Questions?
I really, really like the mixed use, the use of the land, the variety of housing it brings the community. It's stuff that we do need in the community. I don't know that I like the variation from our current zoning district rules we just put together. I think there's plenty of land there to make some contributions, or not contributions, some adjustments to the plat to meet the current R1 and R2 districts. I like Pat's comment on the sidewalk along, what road is that? The Collector Road, basically cut across and put that sidewalk on the other side near the dog park. It eliminates the side yard comments that Pat made. But I really like the project. One question I do have for you, Pat, is what's the timing and when we get in the pipe that direction?
So
How are we getting the pipe there?
the city is studying the feasibility of the pipe and how to engineer it, basically. Probably going to start actually construction in the spring when the land thaws out. But really, it's one of those things where you want the development and the pipe to be going at the same time. And you want one in front of the other. So that's what we've been working, the developer in the city, the entire time. The annexation is the kind of the third wheel. And I can update the planning commission about the annexation discussions after this. Essentially, so after this would be the preliminary plat, and it all depends on the developer when they submit the preliminary plat. The earliest it could be would be next month at your March 19th meeting.
From what I can tell, there's a relatively large amount of green space between where the existing pipe might stop and where the new pipe might need to pick up. Who's covering the cost of the pipe in between?
Well, the city is going to be paying for the pipe.
Okay.
But we incorporate the costs based on core charges that we charge the developer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll build on your comments a little bit. That it would be great if this development did follow the current residential zoning standards with regard to R1, R2. This doesn't feel like just the nature of this development doesn't feel like it necessarily needs to pull us down the PUD route in terms of deviating from some of those requirements. And then the other thing that stands out to me is that it feels off balance with regard to access to 11 with the full access down to the south in the midst of it seems like that's serving much fewer residents than it could. It sort of feels like the natural flow is going to be in the east-west direction, not only because there's all the single-family home development there and sort of the cul-de-sacs feeding into that, that the natural flow is then continuing to the east, connecting up with 11. And I think you said that some of these roads are going to continue. Well, I can see it on the sketch anyways, that the cul-de-sac to the northwest and the north-northwest potentially may continue into adjacent developments. So don't we think that east-west road is more of a natural, that wants to be where the full access is, rather than just right in, right out, as opposed to sort of taking a turn, heading down south, and then cutting through a slight curve. That just doesn't feel like it's accommodating a higher traffic volume. But that full access is going to pull this entire significant amount of this development to be able to pull into and pull out of the neighborhood, depending on where they're coming from.
I agree with you, but there's a hill right there too. Does that hill have something to do with that?
Just give me a second, I pull this up.
Yeah. So I guess what my feedback, it may not. I'm not suggesting that you flip it, but I'm just wondering if that consideration alters, where the imbalance in terms of access, access to the full access intersection. It's sort of that full access seems off center in terms of the number of households it's serving and where the demand is going to be.
So this is the plan that was discussed as part of the comprehensive plan 2040. And in here you can see we were trying to look at the county's planning requirements for distance between intersections. This is County Road 11 on the right-hand side of the map. The black and the white are the right-in, right-outs, and then the full black circles are the full intersections. So you can see it kind of has a separation already, and that's how we devised this plan. The other thing that we did look at just a few months ago was a east-west collector that would go through, similar to this north-south collector, the blue collector, which would have no lots, but it would be more of a traffic collector. So this would be a east-west collector, but because of the steep slopes and because of the wetlands, it was determined that the best way to do this would be a neighborhood collector, one of those hybrids that would go to the north and to the south around that wetland complex. Does that make sense? Does that help?
I guess I was, while you were talking, I popped open the development that's happening to the south as well, and that sort of has a similar situation where that entire development of both the townhomes and the single family is restricted to only a right in, right out for that whole development, meaning that it's actually going to rely on that development to come into this full access.
Correct.
So I guess if you factor them both together, the full access maybe is more centered than what I was initially seeing.
Right. And so this plan that we came with, and it's not part of the comprehensive plan, but we kind of use this as discussions with developers of where the neighborhood collectors and the collector streets should be, to kind of get an idea. But both of these plans are consistent with this collector classification roadway plan.
Other thoughts or questions?
I just think you're very right about adhering to our zoning, R1 and R2, setting a good precedent for what is going to continue happening around our city as we annex other lands.
Well, I think as a group, there was, the effort to move towards standard zoning was to, I think, manage expectations among neighborhoods and among developers and sort of unify those requirements. But also it wasn't that the intent was to disallow PUD, but just that reserving the PUD process for a more unique situation in which, cluster housing or significant features of the site really dictated a different or a unique approach that, so I think splitting the hairs over any one or two factors or, aspects of the standard requirements isn't necessarily in the spirit of the, of our approach. And so
It's good.
I think that would certainly make this, I think it would strengthen the development if those requirements could sort of fall back in line. One of the other things I guess I'll just add to that is side yard setbacks. We talk about side yard setbacks quite a bit, but I always think it's important that the context is maybe more broad than initially thought. It's certainly there's aspects of appearance of a neighborhood, and this idea of a wall of houses being less desirable, and that being reason to create some separation. I also think it has to do with, and the other aspect that you mentioned was like whether there's windows on the garage side or windows facing. So I think, proximity to neighbors and the perception and the quality of life that comes with that. Those are two things that you mentioned in the report, but other factors are like the spread of fire. I mean, the recent history elsewhere in the country has reminded us that, I mean, there was a time when that was a key aspect of why we created separation among our buildings. And it's another reason why when buildings are too close, there's requirements for fire separation and fire-resistant materials that create that separation. But you can sort of protect yourself from yourself by not spacing your buildings so that a whole neighborhood goes up in flames when just one house starts a fire. I think another aspect is sort of protecting residents from themselves in terms of the ability to have access to your home over time as ownership changes, getting equipment in the backyard to, you know, do an addition or to trim some trees or to deal with a problem on site. It's particularly critical in developments that have back-to-back lots in which, you know, access from your neighbor isn't practical. Maybe less of a concern when you're backed up to public property, but so I just sort of want to point out that when we talk about separation between structures, it's more to do with just how does it look.
I agree with all those comments.
Good point.
Two other comments I'd add is drainage. I know our city engineer would rather have the houses spread at 10 feet apart, 10 feet side yard setbacks versus the 8 and 8 as being proposed, because it's difficult to accomplish the drainage in between. The other thing that we were talking about too is the maintenance of these taller homes. Again, the 8-foot side yard setbacks work if the homes were shorter, because you don't need a tall ladder. But if you were putting a tall ladder on this, you'd probably most likely have to put it on your neighbor's property to access to get up there.
And when you start getting closer, other things start mattering more and more, right? Because that setback is to the wall, to the foundation line. But inevitably, there's overhangs for your eaves on your roof, or bay windows, or air conditioning equipment. I mean, here, even in that photo, there's a unit hanging off the side of the wall. I mean, a neighbor puts up a fence, so all of a sudden, you know, when you're too close, all those things start getting in the way and causing a problem for both you and your neighbor. Maybe we can shift gears a little bit from that. Can we talk a little bit about trails and access? I appreciate the perspective in terms of the park and its central location. I think sort of captures the synergies between this development and the development to the south. But it feels like access is even more important then. So I think it would be good to gain clarity around the ease of access among both developments to that sort of central amenity. Because I heard you say that there's potential for wetland evaluation and potential limitations to crossing that area. I guess that would be a recommendation that, you know, before it comes before us again, that some of that have more clarity and get sorted out with. I think it's a good aspirational goal, that it's convenient and easy to get to by both development. I mean, this is really serving like almost like a regional park in terms of its location, and in the long-term comprehensive plan, this general area was identified as a key location for a regional park. That's, I think, what this is going to likely become, right? Certainly with the development of this park, it will limit a sizable park anywhere nearby, the practicality of it. And with this being a good-sized park, it's a little premature, but I'm assuming that there's some partnership with the city in terms of, or is this park intended to be developed by the developer, or is this a park in which the land is provided to the city for the city to develop, and is it part of the park plan to do so?
So it would be dedicated to the city. It'd be a city park. The park commission would figure out the use of it. Typically, the developer would grade it for the city as part of doing the mass grading on the entire site, and then they'd probably typically seed it. But then any of the improvements beyond that would be up to the city's cost.
Okay. Is that something that we would expect to have been sorted out before it comes back before us for preliminary plat?
Before it comes back to the, preliminary plat, we should have it sorted out. It should go to the Park and Rec Commission, get their feedback on it.
Okay. It seems like a pretty sizable park and sizable investment to make it happen, and I think
Right.
given the number of households that it serves, it'll be, I think, an important amenity with regard to timing.
Right. And big part of it is making sure that the ball field, the soccer field, the skating rinks, all that type of stuff, it fits on it. So even though the minimum acres is 5 that we mentioned, it's kind of a odd shaped park. So we need to make sure that everything that is needed fits on the park. And we'll do that between now and the preliminary plat.
Anybody else? Questions, thoughts?
Mm-mm.
I'll keep going if you let me.
You're doing good. You're very well pointed.
I'm curious about the Chaska development across County Road 11. It's noted as Greenway Belt. Is that the right terminology?
Correct.
Is that passive, or is that active? Is there trails associated with that? Is there some interconnectivity that's to be evaluated?
Trails, I do not know, and I could look into that. But we will have a trail all along County Road 11 on the Victoria side. But that's a good question. I'll look into the trails from Chaska where they're proposed. It is proposed to be a green belt, so it's one house per 40 acres.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe just sort of by definition what that, so if it alludes to density, then it also seems to sort of drive a intended use or other intended goals. You know, is it intended for wildlife passage, for example, you know, like consistent with some of our green ribbon, greenway ideas, or is it, you know, more active use in terms of bike trails and nature trails and that sort of thing? So it seems wise, since we're down here and adjacent, to sort of understand that and capture any synergies if there are some. And then that had me also thinking about, you know, in the long-term comp plan, there was ideas of was it green ribbon is what we talked about, sort of creating this zones, and there was, you know, a rough goal of 100-foot wide when we think about those interconnected zones of wetlands and woodlands. And I'm wondering, when we look at the south of this development, is that a potential opportunity, and are we capturing that in terms of there's some wetland here delineated along with some preserved wooded hillside within and around the park? Are we capturing the goal with not only to the south there's future development, but is there, can we capture a wide enough zone, I guess, to connect to other natural areas to the west? I don't have a good sense of whether that's practical or if directly to the west some intense development is anticipated similar to some of this. Maybe we don't, it's not my goal that we answer that question today, but I just think this is feedback for consideration as we sort of look in more detail about how this plan gets refined. And then, Pat, you touched on some of the right-of-way issues from, I think it was the engineer's report. I think this had to do with the right-of-way with the roads. Does that seem problematic, or does that seem reasonable for some of those adjustments to be made as this goes forward?
I don't think there really is an issue with the right-of-way width. It's 70 feet for the neighborhood collector and 60 feet for the residential, and that's what they have proposed. And then for the townhomes, it meets our 24-foot setback for the private streets.
Okay.
I know I just got a letter from Carver County talking about right-of-way, that they talked about what is required or is going to be requested along County Road 11. I haven't been busy to even forward that on to Mike at DR Horton, but I will probably tomorrow or Thursday. But essentially, that's something that it's not a major thing, but we'll just have to work with that through the preliminary plat.
Sounds good. Well, this is a good opportunity in the process, I think, to share feedback both ways. Is there any comments from the developer or perspective that you want to share with us?
Yes, if I could.
Absolutely.
Mike Sewell with D.R. Horton. Thank you for having us here tonight. We're excited to be back to Victoria. It's been a while since we've been in your fair city, but we're excited to be back. As Pat laid out in the beginning, we've had quite a few iterations already. We've been trying to listen to your comp guide plan stuff, your transportation plans, feedback from city staff. So as you look at our site, we tried to respond to the Greenway corridor with word between staff and us putting the park there and saving the wetlands and trying to save as much of the trees as we can. The transportation that you talk about, you did hit on the point that the full access is based on the county spacing, so we're kind of locked into that area, and it serves both north and south, so I think it makes sense, but we certainly heard what you were saying, and it does look offset on our plan, but when Pat adds the stuff to the south here on the next meeting or next agenda item, it may make more sense. To the zoning and such, we were operating underneath the R2 zoning because we reviewed your codes and your zoning ordinances that you guys just passed. Our homes can fit within your R2, and we think it will work for our neighborhood and what we plan to build. The majority of the cities we work in are about 7.5 or 10 and 5, so 15 feet between the homes are working in the majority of the cities around the Twin Cities. And we've sold there. Our buyers are telling us they don't want to be house poor and they don't want to be yard heavy on maintenance. They have kids that they have to get to games. They have weekend sporting activities. They want to get out and enjoy life on the weekend, so they don't want to be maintaining their yards. And I know 1 or 2 feet doesn't sound like a lot, but to some of our buyers, any yard work is too much. So that's why we chose going with the R2 with our planning. I guess I'll have to double check, but I didn't think your R2 had any height limits for homes when I read the code, but I might have missed it. I don't know him as well as Pat and his group, so I'll defer to him if he says I missed it. Our house styles, just to be clear, what Pat calls a villa, we call a raised ranch in our world, and it has 2 stories on one part of it. Half of it's like it's the old split level, but the entryway isn't split. You walk in the kitchen or dining room area, and then it's either a front to back split halfway through the house or it's split side to side. So there are 2 stories on a portion of it. I just want to make sure that when we talk about it, you're not thinking it's a one-level home. It has some stairs in there, and it is split. Our 2-story homes are typical 2 stories. They both come with 3-car garages. They will have adequate parking in front for people to park in their driveway. Our townhomes, right now we have a 3-story is what you've seen. I don't have a 2-story townhome yet to show you because we're trying to develop it in response to what the market folks are looking for out there. Some people don't like the 3 levels of stairs, so we're kind of trying to come up with something that's not as stair intensive. Price ranges on them, just to fill you in on that. Our townhomes will be somewhere around 300. We're hoping to be under 300, but costs and finishes will dictate that. Our what we call raised ranch, what Pat calls the villa, our express homes, they'll be in the mid-3s to upper 3s. So that's about where we find entry-level single-family homes right now. The first-time single-family homes are about that price. And our 2 stories will be $450 to the 5s. I mean, again, it's based on finishes. Streets, I think, the only thing I'll point out on streets, and then I'll be quiet. On our neighborhood street, we've been trying to work with staff and listening to what they're saying, but we have 2,500 lineal feet of street out there, so about 5,000 on either side, and I only have driveways on about 600 of it. So I think I'm doing a really good job of coming up with what the city staff wants and what the city is looking for, so I really would like to hang on to one more lot, because I'll remind you, I get to pay for it once when I develop it, but the city has to pay for these streets multiple times. They either have to do maintenance, seal coat, patching or whatever, and then they have to rebuild it at some point. So you folks will have to pay for these streets down the road again, and if there's not enough homes to afford it the first time, it's going to get hard to afford it the second time. So I understand what Pat's saying about limiting driveways, and I think we've come up with a good compromise where we've limited driveways just to one spot and not have 80-foot or 85-foot wide lots along the whole length. So that's my,
Just some
yes.
clarification, if that's okay? In the notes, we see, we heard the term villa. Now, villa is a variable term we've learned
Yep.
in the past. And we generally, in the past, we discussed villas might be an association main development. Is that the case
Nope,
here?
nope, these are true single family. The folks own the yard, they maintain the yards. The only place we have association maintained right now is the townhomes.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Dave Gashtock, 10100 Victoria Drive. I just wanted to clarify something about, this being a regional park. It was never designated in the comp plan to be a regional park. If three of you members were on the, the steering committee with myself, and at first on the south side of the waterway, that woods there was designated as for a park, and I'm like, great, buy it and turn it into a park, and then it went off from that and it got moved elsewhere. So I think D.R. Horton's done a great job of doing extra land, for the park, making it bigger to accommodate, your needs that you need for the city, because we're doing it for the neighbors too down below. The other thing, I don't know if all of you read the paper a couple weeks ago about housing and the costs. Government accounts for a third of the cost for housing today. So the more and more restrictions and the more the developers have to give up, naturally the prices go up and the affordability index goes down. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that last bit of feedback. I didn't mean to suggest that this was, I know by definition, regional park is something different. I was maybe more loosely just referring to that a significant number of households that will appreciate and utilize this amenity, right? And so this is the early stage in the process where if we recognize that and, we recognize that it's balanced between this development and development directly to the south, if we can sort of figure out the access so that's convenient and it's a true amenity, where people can walk and ride their bike to it, as opposed to hop in a car and drive around the neighborhood and go try to park somewhere, that contributes to other challenges. And so I just think that's something that would be good to evaluate as you go forward in the plan. One of the other things I was recognizing, after we've talked about that full access in this development being central to both this development and the one to the south, there's the potential for there to be a high demand coming out of the neighborhood. I know in the past when we've had a situation like this, we've talked about stacking, where if a significant number of cars are queuing up to, I don't know if that's a stoplight or a stop sign or whatever, but just making sure that some of those crossroads that are trying to connect onto that road, it's not creating a difficult situation in terms of getting on that secondary road. Does that make sense what I'm describing?
Yeah, and Kara, our city engineer, is cognizant of that stacking requirement, and that's one reason why we prohibited any direct access onto that little neck area that comes out of that full access. But I will mention that comment again, just to make sure that even this driveway that serves the townhomes, making sure that that doesn't impact any stacking, as you
Yeah,
mentioned.
just
Right.
give it some thought. That's-
Yep, I'll pass that along to Kara.
All right, you got what you need on this one? Anybody else have anything before we move on? Good? Okay. So this is just sketch plot, right? So we're not looking for a recommendation or an action, so we can move on to the next item,
Yes.
which is the Welter sketch plan.
Peter Knabel is the applicant. He's representing Golden Valley Land, Inc., the developer. They are proposing to develop the Welter site, which is just south of what we discussed along County Road 11. They're looking at doing 140 single-family lots, 42 townhomes, 60-unit apartment building, and 153-unit senior housing building, and 2 office space lots. Here's the location. There's a railroad that kind of bisects the development into thirds, 2/3 being to the north and roughly 1/3 being to the south. Again, west of County Road 11. Here's the proposal is, again, the townhomes that would be closer to County Road 11, 52-foot wide lots for single-family homes, 66-foot wide lots, and then 80-foot single-family wide lots. Again, under the direction of staff, they're trying to create larger lots, typically along the neighborhood collector, and limiting the number of access to the neighborhood collector. Ultimately, of the 140 single-family lots, 21 would be at 80 feet wide, 90 would be at 66 feet wide, and 29 would be at 52 feet wide. The comprehensive plan, the comprehensive plan steering committee, staff, and the planning consultant, we're working on the comprehensive plan draft 2040, close to 2 years. Part of that was the whole draft of the plan was developed through participation of citizens, stakeholders, and various elected and appointed leaders of Victoria. To get community input, they did an online survey in the spring and summer of 2017, and then they did an open house in October 17 to review the alternatives, and a second open house in January 2018 to review the preferred direction. So they had extensive public engagement in the comprehensive plan. The city also hosted an online mapping tool where the public was able to make specific comments on the comprehensive plan. In addition to the community-wide outreach, the project team also worked with property owners in the areas projected for the new growth, as well as representatives of Laketown Township, downtown business owners, and other key stakeholders to gain input and concerning the comprehensive plan. For the subject property, the comprehensive plan steering committee and the planning commission recommended the area south of the railroad tracks to be used for flex employment. The developer requested at the city council that change from flex employment area to a high density residential to accommodate the senior housing and apartments. The city council did not approve the comprehensive plan per se, but what they did was they authorized submittal of the draft comprehensive plan to the Met Council. The Met Council would then review the draft plan, bring it back with comments to the city council, which ultimately will adopt the comprehensive plan sometime in the spring. Because the mayor and 2 council members were not on the city council when they authorized submittal to the Met Council, staff is requesting the planning commission and the city council ultimately to review the decision to change that from the flex employment to the office, or flex employment to a high-density residential. The flex employment district is intended to diversify a number of reasons. The flex employment district is intended to diversify the city's tax base to withstand unforeseen economic cycles and to provide employment opportunities for Victoria residents that are closer to where they live. Right, currently 97% of our property is taxed at a residential rate. 2% is commercial and 1% is other. So to diversify that land uses to make sure that our economy is stronger in the future is important, to get away from all residential and add more commercial and office space. Looking at the comprehensive plan, the guiding principle, there's like 8 guiding principles. One of them is economic and fiscal strength. Victoria will actively build its tax base and the diversity of businesses in order to provide fiscal strength to the community and to help fund the high level of services and amenities that the community desires. One of the goals of the comprehensive plan is that Victoria will maintain a healthy balance between residential, commercial, business park, office, and park and open space land uses. And the policy is to promote industrial and office development and redevelopment to build the tax base and generate revenues sufficient to support residential development. Just for comparison purposes, if you looked at the city of Victoria and the city of Chaska, the final size of Chaska is going to be smaller than the final size of Victoria. And that doesn't even include the area that's outside the 2040 growth limit. So even this diagram the size of Victoria would be even larger. We're just looking at what the growth limit is going to be in the comprehensive plan for up till 2040. So even though that Chaska is smaller than ultimately Victoria, this is a comparison of what Chaska Industrial Park, or all of industrial in Chaska compared to the industrial in Victoria, and it's less than a quarter of what Chaska ultimately has. If you add the commercial, which is more commercial planned for Victoria than Chaska, that commercial industrial area does get a little bit bigger, but it's still around a quarter of it. And then this shows the final size of Victoria versus the final size of Chaska, and then the land uses on the industrial and commercial and industrial in comparison. But it's not only Chaska. If you look in the comprehensive plan, there's a table showing the employment of Chanhassen and Waconia. So even Chanhassen and Waconia have a higher jobs per ratio than Chaska does. They're at 1.51 jobs per housing ratio, and Waconia is at 1.49 jobs per ratio. Victoria right now is at 0.35, and that just highlights the need to have more office space for employment. One of the things that Chaska really strove for higher employment is just the ability for people to work, live, and play essentially in the community. And not only that, it's one of the better ways of reducing traffic on the county roads. And Highway 5 is, instead of having everybody to have to move or go east to work, you provide the job opportunities to have people working and living in the same community. With that, the comments of the side yard setbacks are very similar. They're also requesting 8-foot side yard setbacks, and actually 6-foot side yard setbacks in the 52-foot lot, single family lots. And our minimum for the R2 district for semi-detached townhomes is 8 feet. So that would be exceed the R2 limits. As mentioned before, regarding the park, we've recommended the developers to kind of look elsewhere for the neighborhood park. The neighborhood park would be in the development to the north. However, staff is recommending, because of the apartments, if the apartments are located, that even if the apartments were located north of the railroad tracks, we'd want some type of a private space, either private or public space, for those apartment uses. Also, they're talking about the water treatment facility. Currently, it's south of the railroad tracks. Again, we'd recommend having it north of the railroad tracks, kind of act as a buffer between the residential uses and the railroad. The railroad is an active railroad, has 3 to 5 trains per day running along it. Not only that, it's also cheaper for the utilities, the pipes to go underneath the railroad tracks to keep it on the north side of the railroad tracks. They are, one of the requirements is to have a berm along County Road 11, but we'd also recommend having a berm between the single-family neighborhood and the railroad tracks. Right now, they're proposing to have a pond. The subdivision ordinance requires that streets align with each other, and if they do offset or jog, that they have to have a distance of 150 feet between the center line and the streets. So this street right here would jog over to here, and then this street here does another jog. So we'd recommend that these streets align, or if they don't align, to have a distance between 150 feet between them. And with that, if you have any questions, staff recommends, again, that the flex employment area not be used for the water treatment facility or for the apartment high density, and that it be reserved for the flex office. Again, this is a sketch plan, the time for the planning commission to provide comment for the developer where they move forward for their preliminary plan. If they have any questions, otherwise the developer is here also.
Thanks, Pat. Initial thoughts, reactions?
Just for clarification, I came in late and missed part of it. I apologize if it was already brought up. The senior housing, is that actually for service? Will that be have staff there, assisted living type facility?
We don't
Strictly residential.
We don't know that. It typically is for the sketch plan, just a kind of an idea, and then once they go forward, they get more details of what type of housing, senior housing that would be.
Okay, thank you. Another question. You made a comment about the berming and the ponding. Isn't the rail bed quite a bit higher than the grade there right now?
The rail bed is higher, closer to County Road 11 where you see the creek, but then when you go back up, the farm goes out on top of the, higher than the rail bed actually.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that with regard to buffers, I mean, water carries and amplifies sound as opposed to berms. For sure. Cut it down. With regard to, I mean, the same is true for sightlines. So I think that's a good observation in terms of separation that's desirable.
Pond turns to ice in winter, and you get kids back there playing that close to a railroad track. That scares me a little bit.
So Pat, you started with some of this with regard to the evaluation of that approach with regard to the flex district south of the tracks. We're not necessarily, is that coming back before us in some different context, or are you seeking feedback on that tonight as well?
And
with regard to the approach for the flex district south of the railroad.
I think what staff is looking at feedback is that if the planning commission would recommend it stay flex employment, or would the planning commission recommend that it incorporate some high density residential to the city council ultimately.
And can you recap where it previously stood, because there was a draft comprehensive plan that showed it one way, and then it was, there was some late feedback from residents and other property owners that I thought went before the planning commission, but then also went to city council, and so I wasn't sure in what state it went for. Where does it currently stand in terms of how it went for authority review by
Right.
others?
What was submitted to the Met Council was multifamily residential in that triangle, south of the railroad. But it hasn't been approved by the city council, and that's why we just want to, going through the sketch plat process, we want to make sure that the planning commission and the city council is comfortable with giving up the flex employment area for high-density residential.
And was that because that flex area was reallocated elsewhere in the plan?
No, it was not.
Okay.
I think Pat was very well pointed that we need as much commercial industrial as we can possibly get, and the flex use would be a lot more appealing than residential at this point.
Yeah, and I think that at least when the comprehensive plan was developed, this, it's a little out of scale, but this triangle is actually a part of a much broader triangle, much larger and broader triangle that sort of creates a district south of the railroad tracks that seem like a natural buffer. This starts to sort of chop away at that available space and also sort of muddy the waters a little bit in terms of how this district works or what its intended use is.
I got a sense watching, I wasn't at that city council meeting, but I watched it. And I got a sense that, for the landowners and the developers, it seemed it's just I have appreciation for what we zoned this for, or guided it for with the 2040 comp plan, but it's almost an issue of timing. And it hadn't quite been submitted yet, and we're kind of, I don't know if you could go as far as causing harm to a landowner developer, but we're making it difficult for them. And if they would have been 30 days sooner or 60 days sooner, it all just could have happened. So I feel with the council when they said we're just creating hardship for these guys, we should make it a little bit easier. Kind of struggle with both pieces there.
It's tough because there's this balance, right? Because the intent of the long-term comp plan is, all throughout that process and having been involved, there's lots of being upfront that these are guidelines. They evolve. There was a previous comp plan in place. There will be another comp plan. But not only for the role for those of us that were on the comp plan steering committee, but also all of us on this commission, we're trying to balance the long-term needs of the city from a vision perspective in terms of guiding property that is of mutual benefit for all residents, balancing the needs of the individual landowners. It's a challenge. But I with regard to timing, whether it's timing of market demand or timing of when the adjacent properties develop, or timings when expectations evolve with regard to developmental vision and plans, we know what we know. And that could change tomorrow, but at least today we know what we know.
So the comp plan seems a bit ambiguous at the point. What if for some reason the senior housing was actually a full service phase living type facility which brought employment? And what if the apartment unit had retail on the bottom and single family or residential on top, creating them more than mixed use flat space? Would that be more applicable to our goal? I also agree with Pat, we probably shouldn't bring in the water underneath the railroad tracks, so that might need to go north somehow.
So the other aspect though is, how does the development of this property influence the development, the future development of the adjacent property?
Right.
Right, does it support it? Does it work against it? Does it, if it develops in a way that, is complementary and supportive of the adjacent future development, does that help, create better adjacencies and spur more development? Right, or if we sort of deviate from that, are we potentially hindering that future development, or? I don't know that I have the answer to that, but I think it's worth contemplating with regard to this slice of the pie, so to speak.
Right.
Maybe someone related, I don't know if you got the current long-term comprehensive plan in terms of some of the guided development, but I thought there was the intent of more medium-density residential adjacent to the railroad corridor as opposed to low-density residential or single-family homes. In terms of the desirability and recognizing the adjacency to the active railroad, I thought that it's got me wondering if, some of the more dense housing should be more adjacent to that corridor as opposed to the less dense.
So this isn't the draft of the plan that went to the Met Council, of course, because this purple area was what came out of the Planning Commission and Steering Committee discussions. And as Commissioner Chair Leshen suggested, that this triangle piece was the flex employment commercial area south of the city. And the big part of it is the railroad tracks, using that as a buffer between the residential to the north and the commercial and industrial to the south. And also just limiting the number of people who are living along the active railroad as well. With that though, Chair Lesh is asking about the single family, and here it does show a medium density residential where they have single family homes, I think.
As opposed to, yeah, well, I think it's just, some of us were on the steering committee, and remembering, there was a thoughtful approach to that arrangement, recognizing sort of the desirability and adjacency to potentially less compatible uses. And so that's different from what we're seeing in the sketch plan, which has, the higher density, like the townhomes along County Road 11, but, the single-family homes lined up right along the railroad tracks. And so I guess I'm just, since we're seeking feedback tonight, I'm just questioning whether or not that's the right approach, not only from a distance standpoint, and we talked about the berming and versus the ponding, but also just from a compatibility standpoint, should that be reevaluated? Both because it's guided that way, but also because it was guided that way with, I think, good intentions to consider.
One thing I would suggest is that when they were doing the comprehensive plan, I don't think they talked about having a 5-acre water treatment plant. And so staff was thinking that probably the best location of the water treatment plant would just be north of the railroad tracks, where that high density or the medium density residential would be, just eliminate the number of houses or even the townhomes that would be abutting a railroad corridor.
Mm-hmm.
Quick question, Pat, if that's okay. Is the water treatment plant also the lift station we talked about?
No, so the lift station is separate.
Okay.
The lift station also is being recommended to be north of the railroad tracks.
And the water treatment's 5 acres?
Correct. They determined it'd be 4 to 5 acres, but they wanted to be conservative and make it 5 acres.
Okay.
Another comment regarding zoning, I think we'd like to see it closer to straight zoning versus again modifying the current setbacks and the current zoning that's being proposed. PUD that's being proposed.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I would echo some of Pat's concerns about alignment of streets. Something else that just occurred to me is, so with regard to this, the triangle south of the railroad, there's a full intersection there. And so I'm betting if you were to pull up that other county plan, that would show that the next intersection is probably a limited right in, right out. And so I think we have to recognize that this may be the primary entrance to what is a future flex district.
Great point.
So, you know, that's the opportunity to sort of manage expectations and recognize that that's where the traffic flow is likely to come and go from. That may be a missed opportunity if we start going a different direction with other uses. Is there other stuff we're missing, Pat? You hit a lot of thoughts, I thought, when you were going through the staff report. I just want to make sure that you...
No, again, I would just, if the planning commission wants to look through the list that staff has already started, and if you want to delete any of, if you think we should delete any of those, or add any to them, or make any changes.
Yeah, you mentioned maintenance access to stormwater ponding.
Correct.
I think that's proven to be important in the past. So before we get too far along, I think it's worth echoing that is important, and there may be some in which that isn't quite obvious yet. Well, if the developer's here, certainly give you the opportunity to share some thoughts or ask some questions. I mean, we're sharing lots of perspective and asking questions of ourselves, but the dialogue is important because there's, I think, some work to do yet on this plan as we go forward. So.
Right. Excuse me, Matt Pavick, Golden Valley Land Company, also Civil Site Group. We're the engineer on the project. So, yeah, we're primarily here tonight, to get feedback, because it's such a kind of a change from what we've submitted. So we really need to get, I don't know what I call it, kind of a firm direction on if you really support the flex south of the tracks, or if not. We would really appreciate kind of knowing that kind of wholeheartedly which direction that's going to go.
Just to be clear.
Right, your advisory, yeah.
We're an advisory
Yeah.
board, and this will go to city council. I know
Yeah.
that, a staff report will be prepared, and I know there's council members in the room that may be able to characterize the discussion, but, so I think there's more discussion to be had, but
Yeah.
I think it's important that, as a group, we're sort of talking this through, and staff can share that quickly.
Yep, so we would be, like I said, we'd be interested in kind of knowing your thoughts on that. As far as just kind of some of the smaller items, just we were looking at an R2 zoning as kind of the base for what we were setting up for lot sizes, which shows 8-foot side setbacks. So I assume that that's allowed, or that's what you're pushing for, or if it's changing from that to 10. I'd be curious to know kind of what the direction is on that, or some clarity on what that goal is, if it's not R2 or if R2 has a different definition. And then we were also proposing more of a villa style, kind of a narrow home type, which was a 52-foot lot. The idea there being it would be a 40-foot pad with 6-foot side setbacks. It's similar to a project, I think it's called Whispering Hills in Victoria, which is it's an association-maintained villa product. So I don't think that squarely fits into one of the zoning districts, so I'd be curious to get some feedback on that lot size and style and side setback. But then the rest of our single family, we would just be proposing an R2 size standard. The other comments about jogging of streets and stuff, we can fix all that. That's just little details. Access to the park to the north, we can work through that. Depending on the impacts to the wetland going through that one connections point. The alternate would be there will be trails and sidewalks along kind of that main collector road. That would be a good corridor for access up to the park from our subdivision. So that could be another way just to kind of address that issue. I also had one other question. There's comments about some berming along Highway 10 and along the railroad track. We like that idea. That's a good idea. Along Highway 11, though, we have challenges with wetlands all the way along that road. So physically, to get a berm in there doesn't really work. So we have to look at understanding kind of the flexibility or how we work around that requirement. Same with the railroad tracks. There's different elevations. Sometimes the track is below the ground. Sometimes it's way above the ground. So a berm is effective in certain spots. Other times it might be more effective to do more heavy screening with some vegetation or that sort of thing. So again, more feedback that you have on those types of issues, we'd appreciate. So if you have any questions for me, I'm available too. So.
Well, I think that I'll just share a couple of responses to some of those questions, because I think, like, for example, when we talk about the berming, I always like to go back to intent, right? I mean, our intent is really to kind of create the separation that's beneficial to the development overall. It's beneficial to adjacent potential incompatible uses, but it's also beneficial long-term to your residents, right? So that they're not sort of creating a situation where headlights are coming into their living room windows, for the rest of time, and then the city hears about complaints about car lights, or, in this case, complaints that, geez, it's right in my backyard that a railroad is going through. Well, how can we reduce complaints to the city? How can we actually create a better quality of living for residents? And the opportunity is now, right? So understanding that intent, I think, leads us towards not necessarily saying that a berm is required and then we disregard wetlands and or other grade changes, but that the intent is that there's an appropriate separation, either through distance or combination of vegetation and berming, and in the cases when wetland exists, but also, like in this example, knowing that a pond doesn't quite feel like the right solution, but a berm and other separation is. And so I think that's what's nice about the conversation, is that as you evaluate those and sort of refine the plans, that it would be great when we get to preliminary plat if we sort of see demonstrating what that means, right? So if a berm's not appropriate, then show some vegetation, but let's have a conversation at that point in terms of what accomplishes the intent of creating those buffers. So buffer maybe is the better description rather than a berm. Berm is just one tool of many to accomplish that. Is that a fair characterization in terms of our goals?
Yeah, ideally we have a berm because it's solid.
Right.
But if there is a wetland, and I've seen it throughout Victoria, then it's more the distance using it as a buffer versus having the physical berm there.
I think we ran into that further north on County Road 11 too, and we used some vegetation and different combination of different trees and bushes to handle that.
One of the first points as you started was just some clarity on setbacks and R2, and I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think when we're talking about like our goal would be to use our standard zoning, whether R1 applies or R2 applies or otherwise, is that it's sort of all encompassing. So like if the desires are R2 and there's side yard setbacks that are included, I think the goal is also that we're sort of following the standard zoning because it's all sort of been factored in terms of whatever height restrictions and front yard and side yard setbacks and other requirements that go along with it. I mean, is that fair as we give feedback that using standard zoning is desirable?
That was the intent and the goal when we developed it, I agree.
But just for clarification for the developers and staff, is that in the R2, it's a single-family zoning district. It allows 8-foot side yard setbacks with a full-size house. And that's what staff is questioning, is that really what the planning commission and city council wants when the houses are that close together? That's why staff is recommending if they want to have some flexibility of reducing those side yard setbacks from the R2 zoning district for a single family house, they actually look at it 8 and 10 or 7 and 10 side yard setbacks.
Could I ask a quick question? So do you mean if we're asking for something less than 8, or you're saying you want to revise the R2 zoning ordinance?
Well, I'm asking the planning commission and ultimately again the city council is it their intent to go with 8-foot side yard setbacks for a single family house in the R2 zoning district, or does that seem practical? And when you look at all the developments that have occurred in Victoria, and then you're seeing pictures of what that looks like for a single family house, or do you want to do something that's a hybrid between the R1 and the R2 zoning districts, which would be the 8 and 10 or 8 and 7 or 10 and 7?
We do have just for the record, we're the developer on the Meadows of Wasserman Lake, and that's a R2 with the 8 feet. We've probably got 30 houses up, so it might be something to eyeball there too. I don't write the zoning code here, so that's you guys. Yeah, we'll do whatever you want, but it seems to be working pretty well on that project. So.
Yeah, well, we're kind of talking about like two different things slightly, right? I mean, we're talking about, Pat, I'm hearing you question whether or not we really intend for our ordinances to be what they are. I guess I'm of the opinion that we just went through an exhausting effort to get there. And to avoid sort of this in-between thing that it's either one or the other, based on site size and requirements, but it's either all or nothing. So I guess I'd be concerned about going back and questioning that approach. I think the desire is what's based on the lot size, based on all the other factors, what's the most appropriate, whether it's R1 and R2, and then the goal is that it follows those requirements in totality.
And then, sorry, just to follow up with one more question then. Is there a zoning district that fits a narrow lot, like a villa, narrower house pad, or 60 the minimum width?
I think R2 was that district.
Okay.
If I might recall correctly. And I think my personal opinion is I think the R2 fits really well on the tracks. It's got a more of a medium density versus a low density. But I also agree with Jeff, it's got to be R1 or R2 straight zoning, which kind of creates a little bit of a pain point for I think what you may be referring is the villa lots just west of the townhomes.
Yeah, that's where we were kind of
I think that
showing.
needs to be upsized per se to the R2 criteria, in my opinion. I think everything else looks pretty fair based upon the current R districts that we created last year. And to Jeff's point, we spent hours talking about that for many months to get to where we're at, to avoid all the PUDs that we've had to work with in the past.
Yeah, and I think this development's pretty dense, and again, I'm not sure that this development sort of warrants pulling us towards a PUD approach, so it feels like standard zoning, you know, recognizing that the in-between, if that's where we're at, that might be what's causing the confusion, and so the goal would be, you know, which of these lots are R2 and which of them are R1, and the goal would be that they follow the requirements. Because when we established that adjustment to the zoning, it was to avoid exactly this confusion, right? Like, it should be pretty black and white for you as a developer. It should be pretty black and white for a resident that purchased a property and, you know, maintains it, sells it, you know, improves upon it. So we're kind of getting an aside now, because we're sort of talking about the fundamental approach to our zoning ordinances, which I guess I'll just say I'm advocating for continuing down that path, having clarity around these are the zoning ordinances, unless it's a really unique condition that makes us want to deviate from standard zoning, then those are the requirements, they're clear. It sort of helps manage expectations, it helps you develop in a way that is in alignment. And to sort of start questioning whether we can meet halfway or do a little, I think it takes us a step backwards potentially.
I completely agree with Jeff, and our next agenda item will help clarify that comment. What we'll be talking about here shortly.
Okay, so sorry, just for the purposes then for our feedback, we would be proposing that the whole project is R2. So if you can look at it through that lens, that's what we'd like feedback on, because that's, I think, sort of our intent. So what would happen is those 52-foot lots would have to be increased to 60s. And then the other ones would remain at 66 with 8 and 8. So we can have, we'll have a little extra space between the homes on those narrower lots now, because the product is narrower. But that's what we would, so if you could just maybe give us a little feedback on if that seems appropriate, an entire R2, that.
By my understanding of our current R districts, I think that's fitting. If you ask for some clarity on the land south of the tracks, my opinion, I'm just one of many, that needs to retain commercial flex or something that more resembles that more than anything else, just because we don't have enough of it. But I also kind of understand the conflict, because I do remember both conversations going back and forth, and the modification coming, and the other changes happening, being involved in both committees.
I would, to answer your question, and just for discussion, I would agree with that if R2 is your goal, and if the site size and all the criteria associated with that are in alignment with that, then I think that's all we can ask. I mean, that's what our zoning requires, and if you're meeting those, I think that's good. But it's also recognizing that if a given property isn't appropriate for R2 and it's R1, then it's meeting the R1 requirements, sort of as written.
Okay.
Head nods.
Yeah.
All right.
You agree? Okay. Does that help?
Great. Yep, and I don't know if you all want to comment just one last time on the flex zoning, that's the last thing I'd ask for. Thank you.
I'll state out loud that I would be supportive of committing to the flex zoning as it was once conceived, particularly recognizing that this is still an open item for discussion. I think it was a good idea to start. I think it's a good idea to revisit it, and I think that even by adding the discussion tonight with regard to this being the port of entry to a future flex district with the access, I think I would recommend that.
Dave Gashstock. The one question I didn't hear an answer tonight is, what is the difference in the tax collected between commercial and apartments? I own both, and I think the city would be way ahead with an apartment taxation. I mean, I'm hearing this argument that you'd be ahead, with commercial getting more tax revenue, but you got to figure what's the valuation of the apartments, and the tax rate is different between commercial and apartments. And I think that should be part of the discussion too about this.
Well, I'll start by saying I agree, Dave. I think that's a factor, and it's part of the discussion, which I think is a good discussion for the city council to have. But from a planning perspective and a long-term comp plan perspective, I think that, at least for me, it's less about the tax revenue, and it has more to do about what's the future of our community, and what's the desirability of having employment in-house, so to speak.
But this could complement it though, too.
It could, but there's other areas in the city that are appropriate for apartments.
Right.
This
And we've
is-
made other revisions for, Schmieg's, they want to change from higher density to low density. We're constantly changing kind of to what the people wanted, and Schmieg, or Welters, that's why I kind of like, well, that's what they want, They
Yeah.
weren't vocal, I guess they were kind of told, here, this is what we're doing with your property, and I thought that was kind of our concerns too, that we wanted to make sure that people were comfortable with what was going on with their land.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm not trying to discount those conversations and that
Sure.
feedback. I think that at least from my perspective, and I think others can speak and share their perspective on it, but I think generally from a planning commission perspective, it's our responsibility to sort of factor these things in the broader context of what's, the greater good for the community.
Sure.
And there have been other adjustments made. There was an adjustment made to this one, but I'm understanding that it's an open issue, and so since we're seeking new feedback, to be honest, actually, for me, seeing some of the development here in context sort of reinforces for me that reverting back to the originally planned flex for this property, seeing this as, the synergies between the future development of the flex district south of the tracks, and I think that is even stronger now than maybe it was before,
Sure.
from my perspective.
I'm just giving you my viewpoint.
Yeah.
So, okay, thanks.
So, but I don't want to speak for all of us, so I encourage everybody else to chime in and.
I have a question. What's gonna happen on the whatever that city
Chaska
is?
side.
Chaska side. Where's the Hy-Vee going in that we talked
He's
about?
going quite a bit to the west, east of that.
On that road though?
No.
No.
It's another mile and a half or so to the east.
Right, but would you, okay, I know there's a road going, like Pioneer Trails up there.
Over here.
Okay,
An angler would be down below the map where you can't see right here, and that's where that Hy-Vee's gonna be off. to
Off
the
of Angler,
right,
okay.
ways down, towards Chaska.
And back to Justin's comment, I completely concur with your comments, it's very well pointed, especially now that we've identified that primary road being the collector road, getting in and out of that flex district. If we were to put apartments in there without the parks and stuff that are recommended for the current planning process, get a lot of high traffic, big trucks, it just doesn't seem suitable to be mixing the high density apartments in with all the commercial.
That's what catches me up a little bit too. I'm still open on this. I've not decided yet, and I think you answered Dave's question well. I don't think about tax as much. It's more about trying to get, just like in the 2040 comp plan, you want to have kind of like areas together. You don't want
yeah.
big differences. And so that's how I think about that area, just trying to get like businesses there, industries there.
Isn't there some businesses proposed?
Yeah, there is. There absolutely is. But what Jeff pointed out, what really hangs me up now more than anything is that full access, which is really more of a, from a county perspective there. To me, tell me if I'm wrong, I see trucks, big trucks, that's gonna be a heavy usage. And frankly, with the 2040, I've never seen that and I hadn't thought of it in that respect. And when I think of that in that respect, that sort of changes how I feel about it. It's industrial.
I agree.
Any other thoughts? Next. Well, it's a sketch plan, so I think I'm appreciative of I think a good dialogue and good perspective shared. I think there's some work to do on this one yet. And it sounds like there's some other conversations that need to be had with regard to city council. And sketch plans go to city council, right?
Yes.
And so feedback is captured and characterized and summarized, and their comments are factored in, and that all comes back to us as we go forward in the process.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you all for feedback. We'll move on to the next item. For those of us who have stuck with us tonight, we've got one more discussion item, which is the Arbor Woods rezoning. Thanks, everyone. Yep. Paul, going to walk us through this one?
Absolutely.
The floor is yours. Thank you.
Chair, Commission, I'm back. Today I'd like to discuss an ongoing conversation that we've had about the Arbor Woods PUD for impervious surface. This is a topic that we brought up last time. We had some data collection we wanted to do, a little bit of research in order to verify some of the numbers that we saw through some of the planning documents that were presented, particularly the matrix that was discussed last time. I can quickly go over maybe the highlights of last time. In 2014, a 15-lot subdivision was approved. 10 of those lots have been developed, and there are 5 lots remaining. In the past, the original development was for an R zoning, which is basically 30% impervious surface, although there's some conversation about what it was actually intended. Sometime soon after the first home was built, there was a discussion regarding a matrix and the developer regarding specific amounts of impervious surface per lot. That's been kind of the status quo up until recently. So what we're looking for today is that we have an updated matrix of information. This was pulled directly from the staff, I should say the building permits themselves. You can see there's a timeline of activity. Starts with 2013, Arbor Woods was approved. I pardon that 1/1 date, that was a placeholder. But the first permit that we have on file was for 1/13/15 for 800 Arbor Woods. Again, we see it's pretty normal lot design or lot allocation. 25% isn't totally outside the norm. But we see that before the next building is built in 3/31/16, the matrix was agreed upon. Soon after, we start to see the first home after that built, which is at almost 40% impervious surface. Again, there's a note on the building permit itself that said max impervious surface agreed upon for 1/16. So that was referenced. After that,
What was that value? Sorry.
Pardon?
So you said on the permit, the maximum impervious surface agreed upon was the 39.63% or the 30%?
the 39.63%.
Okay, so that was on the building permit.
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason why I note that is that it literally was handwritten on there.
Yeah, so should this chart then in that column for that item actually say rather than 30% under max as stated on permit?
Well, so there was a difference between what the permit said and what the survey said. And so on the survey, sometimes they post like what the maximums are. So we'll say like a setback of 10 feet. It'll have impervious surface. It'll have the easements, so for the utility and drainage. It'll have all sorts of data on there, a lot of grading documentation on there. And on the actual readout, it says 30%, but then there's a handwritten note that said 39.63% as agreed upon via the matrix. And so that's what was used to approve the building.
Okay, so the hand note different from the typed value is different.
Correct.
Got it.
Interestingly enough, The rest of the homes built over the period of the next 2 years actually are conforming to regular zoning, which I thought was kind of unusual, considering that they did have this agreement. Obviously, on the fifth column, it has the actual hard numbers that each lot was allocated. And so with that, what we want to do is just continue that conversation with this increased information. There's still the couple options out there regarding what we do with the PUD and how we formalize it. Whether, we have two possible outcomes, which is propose amendment to the PUD that sets an impervious surface maximum at the 30%, which is the original. There's an option for an R1 standard, which is our current standard at 35%. The impact on each lot would be lessened because we still have, on average, probably 5 to 10% additional impervious surface allocation that's available. Obviously, there's other options that can be considered. That's at your discretion. But those are two options that seem to, especially the 35%, seems to work pretty well with most lots. There's only one lot that would really be out of conformance, which would be legal non-conforming. There'd have to be considerations put in place, obviously. But again, we wanted to continue that discussion. We don't want it to get old or stale. And so we continue to have input into this issue. And again, we're not looking for any motions or that sort of thing.
What the plan is once the planning commission comes to hopefully a conclusion or an agreement, we would send a letter out to the property owners and say, here's the issue that we're finding, and then make that whatever the planning commission recommends as part of the letter, and say that the planning commission will be discussing this at their next meeting. It maybe even have an open house to have it before the meeting, so that in case the number of people want to come and talk about it.
Yeah, so it'd be a discussion item during the planning commission meeting, which sometimes we're able to engage the public, but if there's lots of concern, it's usually more appropriate for a neighborhood meeting beforehand to sort of share information back and forth.
Right. So I have a neighborhood meeting beforehand and then have the discussion in a planning commission meeting.
Opinion, personally, there's been so much confusion on this over the last number of years. And we've had a lot of discussion about straight zoning. It seems like our current straight zoning R1 district be less restrictive than what was planned in the PUD, and probably the fairer option of the two, and also clean things up and make it easier for staff to manage moving forward. So my opinion would be look at option 2.
We're getting towards the end of the development as well. There's
So 5 lots left.
handful, yeah. 5. I think we have 2 on the docket. We just have some tree issues on those lots, but
If we were to go with option 2, would that have any hindrance on what's currently been presented to the city?
no. No, it should be fine. They've developed it in accordance with the 30%, so 35% would also give them some allowance.
If we chose option 2, would that cause any conflict with anything else that's currently going on in development?
I don't believe so, no. The only thing that we would have would be that one unit that's overbuilt for its particular lot, and so,
I think in this case, that's what we call legal non-conforming.
right,
We're roughly 5% over, and is what it is.
right.
So, was everyone here when we discussed this was this at last month's meeting?
It was
or the
last
month
month.
prior? Last month?
I was not here.
You weren't here?
I was here.
You were here, and you were here as well. So since you weren't here, I think it's important as a starting point to remember how this development came about. And what I talked about at the last meeting, having been a part of that process, was that it was very collaborative. I mean, it was I thought a good model in terms of this was a development that came with some initial discussion points for a sketch plat, then actually came back again with two different options, just based on some unique conditions of the site and trying to preserve some of the wooded area on the site, and there were some other I think there was some eagles
Eagles.
nesting on the site, and there was some unique access requirements. And so anyways, I thought that was important because that was at a time when PUD was definitely appropriate, and that the process from start to finish was collaborative in nature and sort of, I think, in line with what we would expect the benefits of that process to be. So I thought that was important to note, only because somewhere along the way, I think there's been some communication about the impervious surface requirements, and I think last time when we met, we talked about there was the matrix, as you call it, that sort of had a range of values that were agreed upon informally, sort of behind the scenes, not approved, not necessarily consistent with the original approved values. I think we were a little confused though last time when we talked about it, because some of the I think those agreed upon values that was on that matrix didn't really time out with the math.
Right. So it's because the matrix was labeled incorrectly, and so it was looking at what the current used proportion was for the building versus the actual allotted square footage. So there really wasn't a percent that was allocated; it was the hard number that was allocated.
Oh,
So there's a table. One of my columns has a table, or table has a column, I should say, and in there it has that hard number.
and
That's what was allotted, was the hard numbers.
It seemed like last meeting it seemed like a lot much more negative impact the last time we talked about this than it looks today.
Right. It's because when we first did it, we took a sample and we didn't see kind of all of the developments that went out there. So we actually did a full deep dive into the whole property file and took out each one, scanned them, and then did analysis. And so we got to see kind of the magnitude of the impact and realized that, yes, if you're doing R zoning at 25%, say that was the hard and fast R1 zoning or R zoning at the time, you probably couldn't build half of these homes. If you did 30%, which is what staff recommended in 2014 but never got put into the PUD, you could probably get away with a lot of these homes at 30%. But it doesn't give you a whole lot of kind of squeak space for putting in a deck or something. 35% obviously would satisfy the majority, if not all, of these homes, save the 39%. And so that was one of our considerations was, what is equitable, but also allowed people to have a reasonable expectation. When they see their lot, they can know that they're getting kind of the same proportion as everyone else.
do we have a sense of what? Reasonable is a really loose term, right? In terms of what a reasonable size, if you got a given percentage of impervious surface based on your home and your driveway, take one of these examples. Let's say that that factors out to be 26%, based on your fifth line item. Does that give reasonable, 4%? I don't know what the math is in terms of what 4% is. Does that give you reasonable size for a deck or a patio or sort of?
That's the tough
range of improvements, and I know that they're all different, but if 4% gets you a 10-foot by 10-foot deck, that maybe isn't reasonable.
Well, right. I think percent is proportional to the total size of the lot. So if you have
it's variable based on 2 or 3 different conditions here.
Right. So if you have a 20,000 square foot lot, 4% will get you a lot further than a 10,000 square foot lot. I think it depends on the size of the home that was chosen for that particular lot. Whether the person who built it or the person who bought it preferred to have a large home over accessory structures. It's a little more easy to do like in a St. Paul or a Falcon Heights where I previously planned, where every lot was basically 7,500 square feet. It was built that way. And so when you're getting your proportion, you know what you're getting. Here it's a little more tricky because lots have variations, through this particular PUD process. It was chosen that we would have certain size lots on the back end through the cul-de-sac, maybe to preserve some of that open space and make it less dense in a particular area and then densify in the center. And you sacrifice certain things when you do that. Yeah. One would be your ability to build that, gigantic gazebo or a pool or whatever.
So you just reminded me of something that I thought we discussed at the last meeting too, which was there's a per lot impervious surface approach, but then there's also an average over the course of the development.
We think that's how this matrix was designed.
Right. So I think that's what we talked about, was that just based on the unique site and the variable sizes of the lots as they're configured and as they wrap around. I think we were thinking that the goal was that the overall development had an average of 30% impervious surface, but that there was variability within. And so is that consistent with what you're suggesting? Like when you look at the matrix that was agreed upon, was that what was happening, was sort of the share, taking from one, giving to another to sort of deal with that variability with the goal for an overall site?
I could see some intentions there, perhaps, going towards that direction, but I don't think that's what they achieved
Yeah.
through this process.
And certainly that may not be equitable in terms of, creating some confusion among neighbors about why can my neighbor with the exact same lot right next to me do X, but I can't do the same thing.
Which I think brings us to the point we're at today, so these guys can better manage it moving forward. When the neighbors come to them and say, hey, I want to build a deck, can I do that? And they have to go back through the math, the calculations, and then go to the notes and figure out how we got to where we're at. Which makes me very thankful that we have this rate zoning, we can lean upon moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So that's part of the question, is understanding the history and how we got there, and there's some ambiguity around it. How can we eliminate the ambiguity, but how can we do so in an equitable manner? And also, I think, balance the goals of, the original intent of the development to be thoughtful in terms of this requirement, but also not create a hardship or create sort of a victim of circumstance if a lot was sold and built with one understanding. To me, that seems a little bit different than those lots that have not yet been sold or developed. Right. Have you gotten any feedback that suggests that 30% creates a hardship?
No feedback yet.
There's one lot that's already at 29%.
I'll give you some feedback.
Some feedback.
Well, since this is a discussion item, is it okay if we?
Oh, sorry.
You sat through the whole meeting, and
What day is it?
the least we could do is talk a little bit. So let us know what you can, if you wouldn't mind, state your name and address and share. Your
I'm Jim
concerns.
Donnelly. Spoken to you. I'm in the mention in your publisher.
Excuse me, Mr. Donnelly, what's your address?
8105 Ridge Road.
8105 Ridgewood?
Ridge Road.
Thanks.
In Lake Bridge. We had entered an agreement to purchase a house over at the Arbor Woods. I had to give them $10,000 of earnest money. They finally produced the plat drawing, and the impervious surface was 35%. Was over 35. I reached out to Paul and said, from what we know, because we've lived in Victoria since 2005, 30% was the max. So, we're like, we don't want to buy a house that we can't even put a pebble on, that's already illegal. And that's when this whole thing started, and he was digging into it, and was it 35% or 30? Either way, they were over 35%. And that's when the matrix came to exist, which was never approved by the city council, but that's what, I believe his name was Rick, was guiding the building of the houses with. So what you had said was what they had told us, that the whole neighborhood had to average 30. But that never made any sense. If you put a pool in, you know, now your neighbor gets nothing. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
So,
So
I-
you said you're in the process of buying a built home or
we were going
empty
to.
lot?
No, we built. We're going to build a home with them on a lot over there.
Okay, so you're in a
Purchase
purchase agreement to buy a
agreement.
lot to then build a home on, right?
To build a home on a lot.
Okay.
And the lot drawing came back, and like I said, the impervious surface was like 35.
Yeah, it was over 35, so that's just to the point earlier about, you know, that it really only impacts the people who are there. That's, I mean, it does impact other people because like my husband said, we paid money, they kept it, they wouldn't give it back when clearly the purchase agreement was not even valid.
Because we entered into a contract with a house that we couldn't do anything with, that we thought was being legally built by the laws of Victoria. And basically, we had to sign a termination agreement to get, before we would have lost more money to them. So, I mean, I don't know what you guys are going to do about that, but that Arbor Woods is, you know, it's not fair to the remaining 5 people that are going to buy homes there without disclosing what the actual impervious surface laws are and what the lot is. And they're not forthright about that at all.
And that's where the ambiguity comes in, and this whole process with the matrix, it just doesn't work because it's hard for staff to manage, it's hard for sales to manage, hard for the developer to manage, it's like, it's all interpretation. It might have something to do with that industry, so I know it very, very well. What's currently in place is nothing but liability.
Well, when Gagne introduced us to Rick, we were
Have to
introduced to him as.
Interrupt you because
Oh, sorry,
we're
I'm
on the TV.
Oh,
and if
sorry.
you want to talk, you have to
Oh, no,
address the
go
mic.
No, it's
I apologize.
No, I was just gonna say, and, you know, just like what Jim said, you know, just the whole relationship, when we were working with Gagne and were introduced to Rick, he was referred to as a person who like smoothed things over.
Yeah, he
So
smoothed
like,
things
it
over
just
with the
doesn't
city.
feel, right?
Yeah.
Like, so anyway, again, like, you know.
Well, the
nothing
good
like-
news is that the challenges you're describing, we're now recognizing.
Okay.
And we're on the path to try to resolve them, right?
Yeah.
And so,
It's just an expensive lesson to learn, I guess.
yeah, well, that's unfortunate, and I think I'm appreciative that it came to light, regardless of how it came to light. I think that there's a gap here that, at least based on some of the recommendations to the staff report, and I think through our discussion, we're trying to come to a resolution in terms of how to address it and remove some ambiguity. I don't know that we know how we're going to do that yet, but that's kind of what we're trying to
Right.
figure out tonight.
But like you were saying, you know, they have people who purchase houses, and I've seen those numbers, but they look much less than the numbers that they show in the matrix. You know, they have, many of the houses are way over 30 in the matrix, so I don't know if, we have a copy of the matrix. And I'm just a little surprised that it's only one house over, because the one we bought was gonna be 35%, and the model they just sold, I think they quoted at 34%. You know, it's not on your list, but obviously, the 30% rule is not being adhered to. You know, so,
Yeah.
I mean, you can't sell somebody something that you can't use, right?
Well, this doesn't help with your $10,000, but kudos to you. Most people have no idea what impervious percentage ratios are. And I know that doesn't help, but
Yeah, it's just because we put, what did we put in our old house? Where they came out and measured? Oh, we put a pool in, and
And down
you
this
actually
road.
changed the laws where the pool surface didn't count, so that actually helped us out where we currently live. But anyway, we just wanted to come and
Yeah.
give our piece.
Well, appreciate the perspective. I think, the goal is to try to reduce the ambiguity.
Yeah, but I mean, there should be something you should be able to do to what they're doing right now. They shouldn't be able to sell anymore until this is taken care of. You know, because they shouldn't be able to take somebody else's $10,000 when they figure out the same thing and have to get out of the deal. You know, something should be done now.
You can speak to that, Pat, in terms
No,
of.
I just, that's one reason why staff put this on the agenda, even though it was a long agenda. We knew that there were some repercussions and we wanted to get it resolved as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Hey, I think the one confusing aspect to this process is that, you know, I shared the comments about what a feel-good process it was.
Kind of derailed.
When thanks again. When we were originally agreeing on the direction for this development and the approval of the preliminary and the final plat. And so, I mean, I want to believe that there was good intentions along the way, but it sounds like there's been some miscommunication or sort of a non-typical approach to, you know, developing individual sites as time has gone on that isn't consistent with, I thought, the spirit of the conversation early in the process. I think I'm saying that the nicest way I possibly can.
You did good.
But how do we reconcile, you know, from an administrative standpoint, what's happening today based on what we heard in that description to managing expectations and getting to some requirements that aren't causing additional undue hardship and are consistent with the goals of this particular development. I'm sort of understanding the staff report in terms of, you know, 30% was communicated verbally. That was a part of the discussion, part of the common understanding. 30% was what was noted in the staff report. So that seems like a reasonable starting point, as opposed to, I think 25% was also a question.
Yeah, 25% is into the residential zoning district when it was around when this development was approved. But I think the bigger key is we have our own spreadsheet that lists all the developments and that we as staff use forever, that has the front yard setbacks, impervious surface coverage, all the other setbacks. And in that spreadsheet, which I think is almost gospel, it has 30%. And so, you can almost see that besides that one house, it seemed like staff was following the 30%, which was in that matrix. I shouldn't say matrix, spreadsheet.
Yeah.
That was a great movie.
So what about the second to last item? Why do we say 35% stated on the permit, but also says 30% in the comments? What's the discrepancy there?
I think in that particular issue, we have the building card, which lists the percentage, and then the building permit, which also lists a percentage. One said 35 and one said 30. I think originally when they were approving this, we had changed the R1 zoning standard to 35. And so the person who was using that was using 35% as their standard, but then realized that it was R, went back to the original zoning and saw 30%. I think another reason why this might be is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we may have had a change in staff around this time. And so nobody really, at least I didn't even know the spreadsheet, existed until it was brought to my attention by the developer or the builder. So I would never think to go to something I didn't know existed.
What, the matrix? You didn't know the matrix existed.
The
I
matrix.
just want to make sure, because the spreadsheet to me is gospel and everybody at the staff knows.
Right.
But the matrix is something that we didn't know about.
Right. So speaking to this, no, it's fine. It is a little confusing because we do have a spreadsheet that has every single development with the development standards on there.
Yeah.
That lists this development as 30%.
No, I like the clarity that the spreadsheet is official.
Yes.
The matrix is a document that was created by a developer that's unofficial and potentially inappropriate,
Correct.
but certainly unofficial.
Right. And so in this particular situation, somebody had looked at the spreadsheet. It says 30. Also maybe looked back and saw that the R zoning standard was the standard and thought it was 30 for some reason. And that's where you got the dual numbers on there. I called that out because it's something that caught my attention. Why would the same person come up with two different numbers for the same permit unless they too were having trouble trying to figure out where exactly this development lands? And so it just speaks to the need to just set a clear standard that's fair and equitable.
Yeah, so, I don't know. What do you guys think? I mean, so the next step is to take a stance as a starting point. I mean, you're looking for a recommendation to then move forward with the community and engage in that dialogue, in terms of, I mean, I would expect we would learn about any hardship at that time. There's a part of me that this sort of feels like 30% has been documented. It was intended. We can't, I guess, fix what's been done to date that's non-compliant. But that's a good starting point. Engage the community. If there's any additional concerns, then we need to sort of ease on that, then that would be reasonable. That's not necessarily where you started though, was it? You were starting sort of going easy because there's sort of the circumstances are unclear, and so one of the things I worry about if we start high, then either there's no reason for the neighborhood to engage in dialogue, or worse, they come and they all want 40 or 45, or because there's been a development that is already at 39, as an example.
And the reason I went high is because somewhere along the line, we can't change the past. And we can only learn from the past. We can only change to affect today and the future. Somewhere along the line, we made a decision as an entity, not any of us individually, but as an entity, to do something that probably didn't make business sense. At the detriment of one party for sure, and probably others out there, and there's probably more to come, specifically in their testimony stating somebody just sold a model at 34%. I hate to penalize the existing residents and the existing developer based upon what he thought he was doing right, based upon somebody in our entity gave him permission to do so. I think it's very difficult for staff to manage this ambiguity. I think it's very difficult for the consumer to come in and buy when they have no idea what the heck they're buying and can find themselves in the same situation. So my opinion is to err on the side of leniency on this, knowing, you know what, here's our current rule, here's our current standard, this we can manage to, it is what it is, we gotta move on. That's just my opinion. I'd like to say, you know what, we think it was this because we thought it was that, because we thought they intended that. We don't know because we weren't there when I love the term matrix was made up, but the spreadsheet was made up. I'd love to be in their head and figure out why we got little side notes and stuff. It doesn't really matter because we can't fix that.
Mm-hmm.
That's where my head was at when I like option B. I just think it's going to minimize pain and minimize liability for everybody involved. Not that I think it's right, but I think that's just the right thing to do based upon the current situation we reside in.
I'm not necessarily hardlined. I mean, I could go along with option 2, but I'm curious of what the others.
I agree. I just think
option 2.
Yeah, it just
sort of
just to ease it. It sounds like there's just so much unknown, this and that, and this. So why not just try and alleviate that? That's tied up with the bow.
And Scott's go to Wisconsin is past my bedtime.
That's right. I got to drive to Madison.
Oh, no.
I'm not going to go that far. I'm just going to go halfway though.
Tonight?
Yeah. Go tomorrow.
You're gonna be the snow. Better than tomorrow.
Let's get a snow before I get to leave.
Yeah, right, any longer, it's gonna start.
All right, guys, if we're gonna get you out of here in time, I'm gonna get us back on track.
All right, thank you.
Mary Jo, I'd love to hear from you.
I just had
How do you feel about it?
I'm sure this is answered in the zoning ordinance, and it's been said tonight, but if we do the math, we've got our setbacks, front, side, back, on our lots, our R2 zoning, what's left? That's the impervious surface, right? No,
That's the buildable pad.
that's the buildable pad
The
plus the
impervious
driveway and
The impervious surface is the structure that goes on the pad, plus the driveway, plus the patio and the deck per se.
you're right.
So it's what gets put on that pad is the impervious surface.
And a
No,
shed,
the
and a
setback.
shed sitting in the backyard, and
Yeah.
yeah.
But the setback includes the patio and the deck.
Setback is
You can encroach.
primarily established for easements and line of sight
And it's the
not
pad,
usually-
not the, okay.
If this is my lot, and I have to run utility, and I have
Yeah,
to have
that's
my line
right.
of sight, it's gonna leave me a building pad, permission to build in here.
I see.
Now the street's here, and I gotta get to my house, right?
Do I have to describe in words what he's drawing for our TV viewing audience?
Absolutely. Or we can hold it up.
Sorry, guys.
I just thought,
That's my impervious.
yeah. I get it. I was making it too easy.
So I'm supportive of option two.
I think so.
I think, so there you have it. Unanimous, go forward with two. I think it'll be important though, when you all engage the public to sort of, share the context and the history and how we got here, so that the stage is set that, this is we think a desirable outcome based on balance, sort of understanding where we started, something happened along the way. How do we sort of come to a common understanding going forward? Hopefully there's no, winners and losers here. It's more about what's equitable for the development.
Well stated.
I think when we present this to the group meeting that we'll have before the next planning commission, that if option 1 or 2 were presented, they'd probably side with you, as opposed to going with the 30.
All right, there's lots of other opportunities to address impervious surface throughout the community as we go forwards. All right, so that concludes our discussion items. If we're comfortable moving on,
Absolutely.
Very.
I'm hoping there's a really concise update of council meeting updates next on our agenda for meetings on January 28th and February 11th. At least those items relevant to the planning commission.
Okay, I'll skip some of them. So, perfect. Planning Commission bylaws, they approved those changes that you were recommending. They put it on the consent agenda. Development review fee, just a quick one, is we had in our ordinance that as-built surveys were required, but we required them depending on the situation. And it got kind of us in trouble with that because we had to pay for somebody's retaining wall. So now we're gonna require from all properties. And then, so, also that we would have Focus Engineering review them for the proposed survey and the as-built survey. So we have to increase the development fee $200 because otherwise the general public is being paid for that process. So that was the fee improvement or the fee change. Steep wooded slopes. There was a very good discussion at the last city council meeting about steep wooded slopes. They want us to do a little more research again, which is fine, and hopefully bring that back to them at their next meeting. They approved, the big one is that they approved the new city manager contract. Scott Stensland was on the interview committee, and if he has any comments, that'd be good. Otherwise, the next one,
It was a great process.
yeah, new city manager starts March 4th. So she's really excited. She's from Burnsville. She's essentially the associate city manager there in Burnsville. So, and she lives in Carver.
Carver, she's on the Carver Planning Commission.
You're right.
Yeah, really sharp. They all were. I mean,
I thought that was a plus.
Yeah.
She's on the planning commission. She understands our issues. I like that.
I thought she might be here tonight.
Well, I'll just give a big thank you to Scott for participating in that process. I know that it was a goal that one of us represented.
Bob was there too. So Bob was nominated. The mayor just sent me an email and asked if I wanted to go, so I was included in it. But it was a fantastic process.
Good.
The consultant, Dr.
Versman?
Really good.
Yeah.
Good people.
And then the last item is the Lake Town Township. So, just a little history behind that. The last couple annexations that we've done, it was we would have to reimburse their taxes because of the loss of taxes based on 90% of the taxes that they received that year, the first year. The second year was reduced to 70%, the third year 50%. Fourth year went down to 30, and then fifth year was 10%. When they proposed a annexation of the meat cutters property south of the Marsh Lake Road in 2015, they were requesting a tax reimbursement of $400 per acre. And at that time, staff questioned if that was logical or some rationale behind that. And it went to the city council, and the city council had that question. It's kind of funny because new staff that didn't know that actually happened is questioning it now. And then Kara, our city engineer, said, well, you should look at the minutes because I think they had that same question back then. So we did, and sure enough, it's in the staff report in the minutes that the staff is wondering what's the rationale. So we went to the township a couple weeks ago. We asked them. They said it's $500 per acre now. And if you looked at the two, $500 per acre for all this development, it would be $114,000, which would be 49 years of taxes for this area. So that's if you kind of compare the two, figuring out. So what we're kind of brought this to the city council says, make an offer of 100% of your taxes for 8 years and see where they go. So we're still working with the township to try to figure out the annexation fee essentially. And the timing of this development, the development and the utilities. So it's kind of a juggling act.
And that obviously could have a huge impact on the development that we were talking about tonight if we can't come to an agreement on the pricing with them.
Right. Ultimately, I think we can. It's just how we do it.
And just for clarification for my little pea brain, they're 100% of the current rate of taxes they're getting today, not our future rate of tax that we're getting
Correct.
tomorrow.
It's actually the 100% of the taxes that they're receiving now.
Perfect. Okay.
Right? And it's only
Our net return is still fantastic because as we develop, the values go up, tax rates go up.
right. I forgot the chart, but they're only receiving $3,000 or $4,000 in taxes today for all that land.
It's really low.
Right. That's all I have.
Very concise. Nice job.
Thank you. Anything for miscellaneous tonight? Anybody? I move that we adjourn. Is there a
Real
second?
good idea. Second.
Everybody, second.
A unanimous second, it sounds like. All in favor? Aye. Enjoy your evening. Drive safely.
Thank you.
I have a safe drive.